Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Kagitingan, the PVAO Historical Webinar Series 2021. I am Nico Oreiro.
And I am Maggie Grace Tahagun. We are your hosts for today, and we will be joining you all throughout the program. Before anything else, allow me to acknowledge the presence of the following. PVAO Administrator, Yusek Ernesto G. Carolina. PVAO Deputy Administrator, Asek Raul Z. Caballes. PVB Vice President, Mr. Mike Villarreal. Mount Samat FTES Administrator, Mr. Francis Initorio. Dr. Neil Marshall Santillan from the University of the Philippines. Dr. Jose Romel V. Hernandez from De La Salle University. Dr. Archie B. Resos from the University of Santo Tomas. And lastly, Professor Marlon F. Agoy-Agoy, MC from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. We would also like to acknowledge the presence of our other partners, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. Right now, we have about 37 participants here in Zoom. For those who were unable to pre-register, we are currently being broadcasted via Facebook Live on the official Facebook page of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office. Before we officially begin the program, here are some reminders for all of us.
Some reminders. In case there are lags, just stay on and wait for it to load again. Zoom attendees will be automatically on mute. After the webinar, the participants who registered in this webinar are encouraged to answer the evaluation form. The link will be sent to your email. The Kagitingan webinar series is being conducted in celebration of the 79th Araw ng Kagitingan and the Veterans Week. It aims to educate and enrich the knowledge of everyone regarding Philippine military history, particularly in World War II events, and promote historical awareness and rekindle love for the country, especially among the Filipino youth. This year-long activity will be divided into two parts. Esteemed historians and speakers are invited to discuss topics relevant to veteran history and the Filipino people.
For the pilot webinar, we are honored to present to you our speakers for today. Our first speaker is University of the Philippines History Professor, Dr. Ricardo T. His presentation is entitled Kagitingan, Filipino Courage and Selflessness During the Battle of Manila, February 1945. And our second speaker is Research and Education of the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation Vice President, Ms. Desiree Benipayo. She will be discussing Remembering the Battle of Manila.
So to formally commence our program, we would like to invite everyone who can to please rise and join us in singing the Philippine National Anthem, to be immediately followed by our prayer.
Kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang mag-ibig, elas ang sinakalan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyak ka ng mag-ibig, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisigil, sa nagatak tutok sa simoy at sa langit mo pagaw, ay dinatang tulakaw
Panginoon, sa gitna ng pagkalito at takot na bumabagabag sa amin, balutin ninyo kami ng yakap ng inyong pagmamahal at proteksyon. Palakasin po ninyo ang aming mga katawan. Patuloy na patnubayan ang aming pamilya at mga mahal sa buhay. Tulungan at gabayan po ninyo ang aming mga lider sa kanilang mga desisyon. Pagkalooban ninyo ng lakas ang mga frontliners sa kanilang pagsugpo at pagharap sa karamdamang ito. Aming Ama na pinagmumula ng aming kalakasan, kayo po ang magkaloob ng kagalingan sa lahat ng patuloy na lumalaban sa sakit na ito. Kayo po ang aming sandigan at takbuhan. Sa inyo po ang aming buong pagtitiwala. Dahil alam naming sa gitna ng krisis na ito, hindi ninyo kami pababayaan.
Here to welcome us this afternoon is the Administrator of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, Undersecretary Ernesto G. Carolina.
After which, we will have the Philippine Veterans Bank Vice President for Marketing Communications, Mr. Miguel Angelo Villarreal, and Mount Samat FTES Administrator, Mr. Francis Theodore Initorio.
A pleasant afternoon to everyone. Today, we commence a year-long historical online seminar in celebration of the 79th Araw ng Kagitingan and Veterans Week. The activity titled Kagitingan, the PVAO Historical Webinar Series, aims to instill to the public, especially to the youth, our future defenders, the importance of our military history and the value of honoring our veterans. Seminars such as these play an important role in enriching the historical knowledge of our people and in opening their eyes to the reality and severity of the war that shape our future as a nation. Living in an era of unbridled freedom, we may have unconsciously forgotten the sacrifices of those who fought during the Second World War. We may have also overlooked the epic tales of battles and the heroic deeds of our veterans because of the years that separated us from the war. However, at a time like this, when we are facing a health crisis that seemingly takes away all hope, we need to direct our perspective to the heroes who survived the untold sufferings and hardships of war and take inspiration from their valor and selfless sacrifice. After all, the courage and the unity that bound our forebears is the same kind of courage and unity we need to survive and bounce back from this pandemic. The historical webinar series we have planned for you will feature academicians, historians, and authors who will present narratives about our veterans and their service to the nation. Their presentations will also highlight the events that ultimately led to our country's independence. It is my hope that through this webinar series, we will not only recount the stories of the past, but we will also ignite in everyone a sense of willingness to partake in promoting the heroism of our veterans and instill in us the values of patriotism and selfless service. May this activity also be a springboard for future research and publications about the Philippine military history and World War II. Before I end, allow me to acknowledge the measurable contribution of our partners who were with us in making this activity a reality. The Department of National Defense, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, the Philippine Veterans Bank, and the Tourism Infrastructure and Enterprise Zone Authority, or CHESA, Mount Samat Flagship Tourism Enterprise Zone. Everyone worked tirelessly with the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office throughout the conceptualization, planning, and execution of this webinar series. I would like also to thank our participants for joining us. We have seen the first part of the series together. I encourage all of us to complete this series together. Again, thank you, and I welcome you all to the Kagitingan, the PVAO Historical Webinar Series. A pleasant day. God bless us all.
Magandang hapon po sa kanilang lahat. Sa ngalan po ng Philippine Veterans Bank at ng BFP Sons and Daughters Association, we would like to express our appreciation to the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office for allowing us to partner with you dito po sa Historical Webinar Series na gagawin nyo po this year in time for Veterans Week 2021. Both Veterans Bank and SDI are very involved with the story of our World War II veterans. Veterans Bank has been established from the blood, sweat, and tears of our World War II veterans, and it is tasked with preserving their legacy and providing for their families. SDI, of course, is the group that is a national association of the different descendants of the World War II veterans. These are the children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. So with that, we are really appreciative of what PVAO has been doing to preserve the legacy and stories of our World War II veterans. As you may know, many of them have passed away, and that their stories, or they themselves cannot tell their stories anymore. So we are grateful that they have gathered historians from different universities to speak about them to the youth and the people of today. I have been privileged as a senior officer of the bank to listen firsthand to the stories of the veterans, from the stories of valor, stories of romance, stories of adventure, even ghost stories. And these are the stories that we would like to pass on to the next generation. Not just for nationalism, although that is very important, but also for them to understand who the Filipino is. By understanding who we are able to chart our nation's progress much better and more accurately. So with that, we are again thankful to PVAO.
Good day to everyone. Congratulations to the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office and its partners, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and the Philippine Veterans Bank, on the successful launching and organization of this year-long Kagitingan Webinar Series. The Mount Samat Flagship Tourism Enterprise Zone also commends the educational institutions, academicians, and historians who supported this webinar series. The Philippines is at the center of the World War II maelstrom in the Asia-Pacific. 76 years ago, countless lives were lost in the pursuit of national identity and freedom. This sacrifice is the cornerstone of the Philippine independence and the foundation for its development. The bravery and valor of the Filipinos with the Americans in holding the Japanese assault were legendary. But as time passes by, only a handful are keenly interested to know what transpired during that time. In order to address the widening gap, programs to promote patriotism and valor, like the Kagitingan Webinar Series, are organized. The Mount Samat FTES supports this initiative by implementing a patriotism and valor communication program. This includes regular webinars, ebook publications, dedicated website for World War II history, social media campaigns, regular tours or virtual tour in Mount Samat Shrine of Valor, among others. The program will be launched in partnership with its stakeholders, especially PVAO and the province of Bataan. The Kagitingan Webinar Series and the program of the Mount Samat FDES aimed at building and rebuilding our love of country by visiting and revisiting our history of patriotism and valor. To the participants of this webinar series, you are very fortunate to have the opportunity to learn and know more about the Philippine World War II history. Let us always be reminded that as Filipinos, it is imperative that we know the richness of our heritage and how our forefathers sacrificed their lives for us to have a future free from oppression and filled with possibilities. Let me end my message by quoting Carlos P. Romulo. Let us teach our people again to be proud that they are Filipinos. Let us teach them to realize anew that being a Filipino means having as rich and noble a heritage of language, culture, patriotism, and heroic deeds as any nation on earth. Again, good day to everyone and enjoy the Kagitingan Webinar Series.
And on to the main part of the program, introducing our first speaker for today, Dr. Ricardo Trota Jose. Dr. Ricardo T. Jose is the country's foremost scholar on the Second World War in the Philippines and the Asia Pacific. Currently, he is a professor of history at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He obtained his bachelor's and master's degree in history at UP and his PhD from the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. He specializes in military and diplomatic history with focus on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. He has delivered papers and lectures in numerous conferences in the Philippines and abroad. He was awarded the Outstanding Young Scientist Award in the field of social sciences in 1997, the first historian to be given such recognition. In 2016, he was awarded the Outstanding Alumni Award by the UP Alumni Association for historical research. And from 2013 to 2019, he was the director of the Third World Studies Center of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, University of the Philippines, Diliman. Dr. Jose was also one of the recipients of the 2019 Metrobank Foundation Outstanding Filipinos Award for Teachers. Once again, let us all welcome Dr. Ricardo T. Jose.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining our webinar for the commemoration of Kagitingan, Araw ng Kagitingan, and related ceremonies. It is now 76 years since the Battle of Manila and more than 76 years since the fall of Bataan. So we are commemorating many historical events that occurred in the first quarter of the year in World War II. So let me, since we're commemorating at this particular point the Battle of Manila and linking it up with Kagitingan or courage, I would like to present different aspects of the Battle of Manila seen from a more Filipino perspective. We're familiar with the battle. We're familiar with the pictures of the battle. the number of casualties and so forth. But we're not very clear as to Filipinos who became heroes at that time. So I'd like to talk about Filipino courage and selflessness during the Battle of Manila, February 1945. So the Battle of Manila took place for 1 month, February 3, 1945 to March 3, 1945. It was 1 month of very intensive fighting, very heavy fighting. It was the only case of urban warfare in the Pacific War. The Battle of Manila was important because Manila was important for strategic and political reasons. Strategic because Manila had one of the finest ports in Asia. We were very proud of the port facilities that we had. The protected waters of Manila Bay made it a perfect place for shipping to gather, and it was very strategic. Anyone who held it could determine the flow of the war in the Pacific, particularly in Southeast Asia. If the Americans took it, then the Japanese knew that the port of Manila would be used against them. It would be a matter of time before ships and other armaments would be assembled here and sent to attack the next area that the Americans would choose to attack. So strategically, the Japanese did not want to lose Manila because it held many strategic advantages by simply denying it to the Americans. Now, Manila was also important politically, because Manila was, of course, the capital of the Philippines, as it still is today. And whoever held Manila had that political clout, more or less. If the Japanese held it, they had that kind of propaganda value that they still held Manila. But if the Americans took it, then the Commonwealth government could be brought back, and the Philippine government would be able to resume its operations that had been stopped in 1941. So the strategic and political importance of Manila are very well known. This has been tackled in several works. We also know that the civilian losses were very high, that it's been estimated that about 100,000 non-combatant civilians were killed in the 1 month battle. Whether it's more than that or a little less, we are not sure, but roughly 100,000 have been acknowledged to have been killed during that 1 month battle. There were many losses insofar as the cultural identity of the city. Historical documents and historical relics were lost in the battle, and much of the infrastructure of central Manila, that is the government center, Ermita, Malate, the business center, Escolta, Binondo, these were very much destroyed. There were very significant losses in the banking sector, in the government buildings, in the educational sector, because UP, Ateneo, Letran, all of these were in the central part of Manila. And we all know that all of these were severely damaged during the war. The pictures of the fighting are also very classic. This is one of the most classic, iconic pictures of the Battle of Manila. It shows a Sherman tank entering Fort Santiago. The gate has been damaged because of the fighting. There are Japanese inside Fort Santiago making a last-ditch stand this particular time. Several thousand Filipino men had been killed a few days before, and they were in the dungeons to be discovered by the Americans when the battle was over. This is an aerial view of Manila right after the fighting. We see the area of Santa Cruz, Binondo, San Nicolas in Manila. This is to the front, closest to us. This area was burned by the Japanese, so most of that destruction was caused by the Japanese. Across the river, you can see Intramuros, very heavily damaged. Most of the buildings destroyed, partly by the Japanese, partly by the Americans. The government center, you have the post office here, you have the government buildings, the city hall covered by smoke. This is again very classic insofar as the photographs of the destruction are concerned. Other pictures like this show the heavy loss of life. These are Japanese soldiers who were trying to escape in the car. They were captured, they were caught by guerrillas and American soldiers, and they were killed as they tried to escape the car. The location is easy to check out. This is in Rizal Avenue, corner Blumentritt. This is where the railroad, Philippine National Railways railroad crossing is. So you see Filipinos watching after the battle had taken place. Another picture that is also classic, iconic of the Battle of Manila are the many refugees, the many thousand refugees. These are those women and children who were very fortunate we spared the Battle of Intramuros, and here they're waiting to cross from Intramuros to the north side, the Binondo San Nicolas area. So these are some of the typical pictures we get of the Battle of Manila. Another very classic photograph of the early part of the battle. This was taken also in Rizal Avenue, and because the street sign is there, we know that this is corner Mayhalige. These houses still stand. The soldiers that we see here seeking shelter from the Japanese snipers ahead are men from the 37th Infantry Division, an Ohio division. But this is an interesting picture because it shows other things. And if we look closely at it, we will see a number of other items, which I'll point out in a little while. So, Filipinos in the battle. What were the Filipinos doing? Who were they? And what role did they play? So, we've already seen some pictures of Filipinos as victims. They were victims of the Japanese atrocities. They were victims of friendly fire. I mean, American artillery, American bombardment, American grenades, and so forth. It's still being debated as to how many died because of Japanese action and how many died because of friendly fire. But again, the fact that many Filipinos, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were killed during the battle is well known. There were also Filipinos who were part of the perpetrators of that destruction. There were pro-Japanese Makapili. It has been documented that some of them set fire to houses in the Santa Ana area or in Paco. And then there were other Filipinos who were spared the fighting. They belonged to the areas that did not see very much fighting. Sampaloc, for example, the northern part of Manila, parts of Quezon City, and so forth. Many of these people watched as the battle went on, and therefore were onlookers. They were what we would say usyos. They were making usyoso, they were usyoseros. So there were these onlookers. There were also others who were opportunists, shifting sides to see who was winning and who they would side with. There were those who took advantage of the confusion and looted. And so in a way, we would say that peace and order had broken down in many ways. But I don't want to focus on this. I want to focus, since our theme is Kagitingan, I'd like to focus on the Filipino patriots, Filipino heroes of that battle, Filipinos who proved selfless, who were really the epitome of the patriotic Filipinos. So let's start. That picture that I showed earlier, that American soldiers seeking shelter there in the street, Rizal Avenue, corner Mayhalige. An enlargement of that picture shows the Americans seeking shelter, but there is a Filipino here just watching, as if he's not concerned, he's just curious, not doing anything. So this is classic, again, of that onlookers thing that I mentioned. In the second floor of that house, you have the residents of that house, here women and children and a male, looking out of their window as if it was fiesta time, as if there was a parade passing below. So these were the ususeros, those who were watching, those who were onlooking. A third part of that same picture, again, from one picture we see that if you can digest it, you can look into many different angles. This particular enlargement of the picture gives the street sign, Rizal Avenue, Mayhalige. You see a group of Filipino bystanders. They are residents of this area watching as the fight is going on, but they don't have arms. They are non-combatants, so they're just watching. They're onlookers. But one reason why I decided to enlarge this picture was because it shows one Filipino guerrilla. He's the guy who's kneeling next to the post. The American is standing behind the post seeking shelter. This Filipino guerrilla, we don't know his name, is there, and we know he's a guerrilla because he's dressed differently. He's not dressed in the American equipment of 1944-45. He is wearing a Bataan-era helmet, or World War I helmet. His uniform is that of 1941-42. So this is a Filipino guerrilla. And looking at the picture, you would not notice him unless you enlarged it, and then you would see there is a Filipino warrior. There is a Filipino hero in this picture. He was fighting with the Americans. Now, we mentioned looting, we mentioned opportunists, and so there was looting in the midst of battle. This particular Filipino was caught looting shoes from dead Japanese. It's understandable. because during the Japanese occupation, there were no shoes. People had run out of basic commodities, clothing, and all of this. So the Japanese bodies were looted of shoes very quickly. But again, if we go back to the Kagitingan theme, there were many heroes among the Filipinos, and many of them, in fact, most of them are probably not known. There's no marker for many of them. They are not commemorated in many of the ceremonies commemorating the Battle of Manila. The Americans did have their own heroes too. No less than 5 medals of honor were won by the Americans in the Battle of Manila. These were in different places, in Paco Station, in the Customs Building, in other battle areas in Manila. Some of them died fighting. A number of them won the Medal of Honor by killing several Japanese and saving their own unit. At least 2 of them won the Medal of Honor because they sacrificed their lives to be able to protect the men in their platoon or their company. One fell on a grenade that fell close by, and he died absorbing the blast of the grenade. But he saved his platoon, and he won the Medal of Honor for that. Now, insofar as the Filipinos who were in the battle, some of them did win medals, but they are not celebrated. We don't remember who they are. The guerrillas were important in this battle. They were important because they provided intelligence to the United States forces. They provided propaganda, which countered the Japanese propaganda and tried to show that there was a fighting spirit, that the Filipinos were not easily subdued, that Filipinos had not been conquered by the Japanese, and that faith, the Filipinos should keep up his faith in eventual victory. The guerrillas knew the terrain. They were from Manila. They were from the environs. They knew the streets. They knew the places where the Japanese had mined. They knew where the Japanese positions were. So the guerrillas became instant guides to the Americans who came into Manila. It's they who guided the Americans away from the booby traps, away from the minefields, away from the machine gun positions. And so they were able to reach their destinations with little loss of life. And other guerrillas fought alongside with the Americans. As we've seen in the previous picture, that famous picture had a Filipino guerrilla fighting alongside the Americans. Now, aside from the guerrillas, there were other Filipinos who also proved to be heroic in different forms. There was the heroism of medical frontliners, the doctors and the nurses. So today we know that the frontliners are our modern day heroes. But even then, the doctors and the nurses remained faithful to their pledges, remained faithful to their duties, and they tended to the sick and the wounded despite all of the threats of the fighting going on around them. There were others who opened all their doors to the refugees, those who were homeless. These people were residents of Santa Ana and other areas of Manila and outlying areas who opened their doors to strangers, knowing that they needed help, they needed shelter, they needed food. And while food was scarce at that time, they shared whatever they could. So looking at these 3 categories, we would see that these were some of the Filipinos who were involved in the Battle of Manila. And they showed that Kagitingan, they showed that courage, they showed that pro-Filipino-ness, they showed that fighting spirit, that the Filipinos were not down and out. They may have been victims, they may have, some of them may have taken advantage of the situation, but they were truly heroes. And many of them were never recognized, many of them were never awarded medals. So if we start with the guerrillas, the guerrilla units in Greater Manila were many. There was no centralized guerrilla command in Luzon, unlike in islands, unlike in the Visayas and Mindanao, where you had unified commands. Luzon and particularly Manila never had a unified command. There were many groups that existed, not some of them within the city, some of them just outside the city. But they did send agents, they sent spies, they sent operatives into the city, and many of them fought during the Battle of Manila. There was the Hunters or OTC, for example. Most of these were college students who had been sent home when the war started. They wanted to go to Bataan, but they had been sent home because they were considered underage. They should not risk their lives because these were the youth of the country. They wanted to continue the fight. They wanted to keep up their to put up their share in fighting for independence, fighting for freedom. So the Hunters ROTC were one group. UP, Adamson, UST, FEU, Letran, Ateneo, you name it, all the major universities, all the major schools were represented in the Hunters ROTC. There was also the Markings Phil-American Irregular Troops that operated largely in Laguna but also operated in the southern part of Manila. Then there was President Quezon's own guerrillas, mostly operating in the Banahaw area, in Laguna and so forth, but also operating within the southern part of Manila. The northern part of Manila had the East Central Luzon guerrilla area, agents and guerrillas. You also had members of the Bulacan military area. Bulacan is a neighbor of Manila, so they were sending their own guerrillas into Manila as well. And then there were the Blue Eagle guerrillas, among other many groups. For the Chinoys, or the Chinese Filipinos, there were several different groups also, different political persuasions, different leaders, but they were all sworn to defeating the Japanese and helping the Americans win. There were the Wachi guerrillas, there were the Chinese Overseas Wartime Huscan militia guerrillas, there were the Chinese volunteers in the Philippines. So this showed very active nationalistic and patriotic sentiment among these Chinese who had resided in the Philippines for years before. So what were the guerrillas doing during the Battle of Manila? What were they doing just before? Many of them were putting out propaganda sheets. Now, the Japanese had censored all the newspapers and all the media, and so the public did not have access to balanced media. They didn't have access to balanced news. Much of what they got was controlled, censored. It was propaganda for the Japanese. So the guerrillas had to put up counter-propaganda. And part of this propaganda was done through whispers, through oral methods, and others were done through the printing of underground newspapers. The one on the left that we see here is something that was called The Collaborator. It came out in 1944. The editor of this was a young attorney by the name of Manuel Colayco. You will hear more about him later on. But Manuel Colayco had served in Bataan. He did not want to sit down during the war, so he continued and joined the guerrillas. He was a gifted writer, and so he put out this newspaper called The Collaborator, addressing it to Filipino collaborators and telling them what was really happening and urging them to change sides. The picture on the right side shows a guerrilla leaflet that was circulated in Manila in 1944, saying that the Japanese propaganda that they were prepared was really null and void because right behind them was a guerrilla waiting to slash them with a bolo. So who says they're ready? The guerrilla leaflet asks. So through propaganda leaflets and newspapers like this, morale was kept up and Filipinos looked towards the future with hope. There was also, if one didn't have a mimeographing machine or a method of mass producing this, some of them were simply typewritten. This particular slip of paper was typewritten 5 times in one sheet of paper, and then it was cut and into 5 pieces, and those were pasted on walls, slipped into doors, and so forth. This particular one is dated December 5, 1944. Manila was experiencing a very grave shortage of food at this time. And what is this saying? The Japanese are stealing our food. Ginugutom tayo. And it's saying, upang wag tayong mamatay ng gutom, agawin natin ito. Let's steal it from the Japanese rather than go hungry. And it's put out by a very little-known group called the League for National Liberation. This was by a UP faculty member who was circulating this under the Japanese. The guerrillas looked at the Japanese. They watched their movements, they looked at their encampments, they looked at their positions, and they came out with very detailed maps. This is one of those maps which they smuggled out to the American side. The Americans landed in Lingayen on January 9, 1945. By that time, then, the guerrillas in Manila were able to come up with very detailed maps, and they sent it all the way to the American forces in the north. This map is, in fact, dated 1 February 1945. just 2 days before the Americans entered Manila. So it's put up by it was drawn by a Filipino guerrilla identifying Japanese positions in Quiapo, in Paco, Ermita, and even in Intramuros. This was done really at the cost of it was very, very risky. If one was arrested with this, one could very quickly be executed by the Japanese. So this took a lot of courage to put out, to gather, and then to put into a map and smuggle out to the Americans. Once the Battle of Manila started, and once the Japanese propaganda arm was destroyed because the newspaper would no longer come out, the guerrillas took it upon themselves to put out their own newspapers. This time, they were not big newspapers yet. The presses were not yet available, so these were either typewritten or mimeographed, but they brought out the new news that was being picked up by radio and news that was being picked up through the American forces. On the left side, one of the first newspapers to come out of newly liberated Manila is the Herald. This was from a pre-war newspaper that was reborn. This was mimeographed as the battle for Manila was going on. The right side was a newspaper put out by the President Quezon's own guerrillas called The Liberator, showing a Filipino guerrilla arm in arm with an American soldier. This was the Liberation of Manila special. It was printed in the mountains but smuggled into Manila, and already you can see they could use color and they were using illustrations. All of this was being professionally done by pre-war journalists who had joined the guerrillas. Now, the guerrillas were also very much in the thick of action. Now, we know that they were guides, since they knew the roads, where the Japanese were, the mined areas. They could lead the Americans to bypass these. And so the Americans could reach, for example, Malacanang Palace, the University of Santo Tomas, bypassing the Japanese mines and strong points. So they were guides, and this was a very important function that they played, because the Americans, while they had maps, they didn't know where the Japanese were, and the guerrillas therefore guided them safely to their main targets. The guerrillas also served as counterintelligence agents. They identified the Japanese collaborators and spies. They reported them to the American counterintelligence corps, and in some cases even arrested them themselves, bringing them to the American side. And as noted earlier, many of these guerrillas would also wind up fighting alongside the Americans. Special mention should be made of Manuel Colaico, who was the editor of what we mentioned earlier, The Collaborator, the newspaper, the guerrilla newspaper called The Collaborator. So Manuel Colaico had distinguished himself even before the war. He was a student leader in Ateneo. He was a journalist. He was a lawyer. He had passed the bar. He was a practicing lawyer. He was writing articles that were critical of Quezon, but he was respected by the government. He was a reserve officer. He had trained in Ateneo as part of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. And when the war broke out, he went to Bataan. He fought in Bataan. He was a Bataan veteran. He marched the Death March. And in the Death March, his character showed, because instead of simply becoming very negative and marching the Death March just like that, he shared whatever he could. He still had some water with him in his canteen, and he shared this with his fellow Death Marchers. So he was very, very important as a character. He was a very much an example to follow. And after his release from prison camp, he joined the guerrillas, Hunters ROTC, the Allied Intelligence Bureau. He edited The Collaborator, and he is in most of our histories of the Battle of Manila, because it is he who met the Americans as they came into Manila, as they were seeking the quickest passage to University of Santo Tomas, and it's he who led the American forces, the first American forces in Manila, to the University of Santo Tomas. He was accompanied by his close friend, Lieutenant Diosdado Goitinco, who accompanied him with these operations. Unfortunately for Manuel Colaico, he was standing in front of the main gate with the American forces when the Japanese threw a grenade, and it exploded very close to him. He was struck by shrapnel from the grenade. rushed to a hospital, a field hospital in Legarda Elementary School, but the wounds were fatal, and he died a few days later. The place he died was in Legarda Elementary School. This is what it looked like in 1945. It had been converted into a field hospital, and the early casualties of the Battle of Manila were brought here. Colaiko died in this hospital, the school, and the school building still exists today. There should be a marker for its historic role. Now, the other guerrillas did meet up with the Americans. They guided them. We have the names of some other Americans who met the Americans coming in from Balintawak, guided them down to Rizal Avenue. Here we have men from the Blue Eagle guerrillas who met with some American tanks to guide them in, welcome them and guide them in. They are using a captured Japanese vehicle. Others met high-ranking officers. These are Filipino guerrillas who met with the 8th Army officer in command, commanding general, General Eichelberger, south of Manila. These guerrillas met General Eichelberger in Tagaytay and in Parañaque as the 8th Army units were moving towards the southern part of Manila. So here we have the Filipino guerrillas aiding the U.S. Army again in their drive from the south. What's interesting in the picture that we see here on the right bottom is that one of the guerrillas is actually dressed in a Japanese officer's uniform, which meant that he was going behind Japanese lines, disguised as a Japanese officer, and trying to get information from them. So their stories have not fully been told. And again, this is part of the heroism, the Kagitingan of Filipinos in the Battle of Manila. Some of the Filipinos did capture Japanese, and when they captured them, they helped escort them to prisoner of war camps in the Manila area. This is a well-known photograph showing a group of Japanese prisoners of war who are captured. They are being marched down Rizal Avenue. Again, this is the same Rizal Avenue Blumentritt intersection with the railroad crossing behind. But what is interesting here is that there are at least 2 Filipinos in this picture who are taking a major role in this. The one in front, and here's a close-up of him, is a Bataan veteran. He is wearing equipment from the Bataan campaign, and he is leading the Americans, leading this column of Japanese prisoners of war to a prison camp. Here's another picture showing other Japanese prisoners caught by Chinese guerrillas, Chinoy guerrillas. Again, this is in the Santa Cruz area, and here we have Filipino-Chinese guerrillas watching over the captured prisoners of war. There is a Filipino flag flying, so it shows that these were really loyal to the Philippines. The same Filipino-Chinese guerrillas would also put up huge posters like this. This is again in Blumentritt, that railroad crossing that we've seen so often. They put up this poster showing what the Japanese were doing south of the Pasig River, down with the murderer of helpless peoples, in Chinese and in English. And they would put up this as part of the propaganda effort for the Allied side. So other guerrillas would mobilize slowly, come out because they were in the underground. They were underground warriors. They were irregulars. Now that the fighting had broken out, they were now coming out into the open, assembling in full force. And here we have a picture of some of them assembling in Sampaloc. Now, one of the major events of the Battle of Manila was crossing the Pasig River. The Japanese knew that Manila can be divided into North and South Manila, and they could give up northern Manila. They did burn most of Santa Cruz, Binondo, San Nicolas. They set fires there. Then they withdrew to the southern part of Manila and blew up all the major bridges across the Pasig River. So while the Americans were on the northern side of the Pasig, they could not cross immediately because the bridges were down. Guerrillas played an important role here, again, because some of them who were caught on the southern side of Manila crossed the river, either swimming or going through using rafts. They crossed the Pasig River, linked up with the Americans, some of whom were in the Malacanang Palace area or the Malacanang Park area. And there told them where they could cross, the easiest way to cross, safe places where the Japanese were not there. And so guerrillas, Filipino guerrillas, aided the Americans in crossing the Pasig River. And once they crossed the Pasig River, this opened up fighting in the southern part of Manila. In the battle for southern Manila, there was much fighting in Paco, in Ermita, in Malate, and in two of the places where fighting was concentrated in Paco Station and Paco Market, we know that Filipino guerrillas were actively involved in these two battles. Paco Station, incidentally, is where one American won a Medal of Honor. It was really very heavily defended by the Japanese, but Filipinos and Americans stormed it and eventually were able to capture Paco Station. There was also very fierce fighting in the Fort McKinley, now Fort Bonifacio area, and Nichols Field, which is now Villamor Air Base. Both areas were heavily defended by the Japanese. They had taken a lot of the weapons, guns, machine guns, and so forth from their sunken ships, put them in Fort McKinley and Nichols to block the American advance from the south. Now, they put up pillboxes, they put up very strong defenses, and Filipino guerrillas fought very hard. Much of the fighting in Fort Bonifacio was really by hunters, ROTC guerrillas, and they were simply armed with rifles and a few grenades. It was very tough fighting, but they eventually captured Fort McKinley or Fort Bonifacio. Nichols Field also involved very much fighting because this was one of the more developed airports in Manila. Today, this is the Villamor Air Base in Manila International Airport, Ninoy Aquino Airport. And so this was something that the Japanese fought almost to the death for. And Filipino guerrillas were in the front line fighting in these two areas. The areas which didn't see very much fighting, Quezon City, Cubao, Balara, Novaliches, there was fighting there also. Not very much heralded, not very much documented, but there are reasons for the fighting here, as we'll go into a little later. And the Filipino guerrillas, again, knowing the terrain, knowing the places, knowing the people there, were very active in this mopping up in the suburbs. So crossing the Pasig from the Malacanang Palace area, this is what it looked like, crossing through small boats. In some cases, the Japanese were on the other side firing at them, but we can see that there would be guerrillas telling them where to go, and in some cases, accompanying the Americans in landing on the other side of the Pasig River. In the fighting in Paco, now we don't have pictures of the fighting in Paco Station, but we do have these pictures of Paco fighting in the Paco Market. And again, this is one of the few pictures showing guerrillas in action. We know again they're Filipino guerrillas because of the outfit that they're wearing. The big picture shows two guerrillas, one hiding behind this concrete pillar, another running towards the market to try to attack the Japanese position inside the market. The guerrilla who's closer to the camera is definitely Filipino. He's wearing shorts, he's wearing Filipino attire, but he has some American equipment with him, the new American helmet, the canteen, and so forth. The guerrilla who's attacking the Paco Market itself, there's an enlargement of that in the right side, which shows that he is a Filipino guerrilla using the old Bataan or World War I era helmet. So these are not very well documented. They have hardly gotten into the mainstream histories of the Battle of Manila. And yet we know that they were fighting. Some of them would have died in these battles, but we don't know exactly who these people are. Now, this is an aerial picture showing Nichols Field on the left side. In the center of the picture is Nielsen Field, which is now in the Makati Commercial and Business District. They're very close to each other, and out of the camera to the left would have been Fort McKinley or Fort Bonifacio today. Here, they're being bombed in late 1944. By 1945, during the Battle for Manila, you would have Filipino guerrillas active in these particular fronts. The strength of the Japanese in Fort McKinley or Fort Bonifacio was like this. They built these huge concrete bunkers, pillboxes. There are still a few that remain, but most of them have been demolished. This is what the guerrillas were up against. Concrete, large caliber guns, naval guns, 5-inch guns, 3-inch guns, machine guns, machine cannons. This is what the hunters, ROTC, and other guerrillas had to face. Many of them attacked at night. They suffered heavy losses, but they eventually took the camp. Actions in the suburbs and neighboring areas. Much attention has been given to Malate, Ermita, Intramuros, Binondo, Santa Cruz, and so forth, Central Manila. But outside of Central Manila, there were important strategic objectives. In San Juan was the water supply, the El Deposito that the Spaniards had built in the late 19th century. The Americans realized that they had to secure these water supplies so that the people of Manila would not go thirsty. So this was one of the prime targets. San Juan, El Deposito, very close to Pinaglabanan. The tunnels are still there. This was fought for. The Japanese put up cannons, they put up machine guns, and there was a firefight that took place here. There were scattered Japanese units elsewhere in San Juan also, and the guerrillas did most of the mopping up there. In Quezon City, part of the approach towards San Juan was also well defended. In New Manila, big buildings like the Society of the Divine Word or the SVD Seminary, now Christ the King Church and compound, St. Joseph's College, St. Paul's College, these were defended by the Japanese and firefights took place here. Many streets in the area, Gilmore, Broadway, these were mined by the Japanese, booby-trapped, and so they were dangerous. And so the Americans had needed the assistance of the Filipino guerrillas to tell them where to go and where the positions were. Another important source for water were the Balara filters, because now the water that was coming into Manila had to be filtered, and the main filters were in Balara. Here again, the Japanese tried to destroy it, but the guerrillas and the Americans were able to prevent the Japanese from destroying this in very quick action. Very close by in UP, there was Diliman Airstrip, which is now University Avenue. There was also a firefight to take that particular airstrip. Also, water supply was La Mesa Dam in Novaliches. So there also was a plan by the Japanese to blow up the dam to destroy the water system of of Manila. And again, the guerrillas with the Americans were able to prevent the Japanese from destroying this. There's a strategic bridge that connects Bulacan with downtown Novaliches, and that was diffused very quickly in the beginning, but the Japanese were able to blow up part of it. That had to be rebuilt. So these areas were strategically important, giving access to Manila and also providing water for Manila. Marikina was also important because Marikina also had an airfield, and it also provided one of the flanks of Manila. And in fact, the Japanese were in the mountains of Montalban, and they launched a counterattack. The counterattack, in fact, would try to reach up to Balara, try to come down from Antipolo into Marikina, and one counterattack even would try to attack Caloocan itself. So here the guerrillas and the Americans had to be on guard because the Japanese were ready to attack at any moment's notice. So there was some mopping up fighting in Marikina. Antipolo was a different story. The Japanese defended Antipolo almost to the death. They built many tunnels. They went underground. They used the church as a storage area for bombs and ammunition. And in the end, Antipolo was ravaged. It was leveled almost to the ground, just like Manila was. Caloocan also saw its share of fighting because of the Grace Park airfield there. And again, Caloocan was important because you have the Bonifacio Monument there. You have the Rotonda, which gave access to the north. So these areas were not as well known as the fighting in central Manila, but they also were fought for, and the Filipino guerrillas fought in them. This is a sketch of some of the Japanese defenses in New Manila. The street names are there: Broadway, Gilmore, 8th Street, 6th Street. They put up barbed wire, they put up mines, they put up other defenses, machine gun positions. And in fact, an American tank in this area hit a mine and fell on its side. It was a casualty of the Japanese mines. It was there for many years after the war. This is what it looked like. This is not in New Manila, it's outside New Manila, this is in the Antipolo area, but this is what happens to a tank once it hits a mine. So it gets disabled. And so those Japanese mines were very, very dangerous. And since the guerrillas knew where some of them were, their information was very important. This is one of the few photographs taken in the Quezon City area showing some of the Japanese outside the camera firing at these American soldiers. So there was fighting in particularly the New Manila area. In the Antipolo area, there was heavy fighting, and again, the Americans were hand in hand with Filipinos. When men were wounded, they had to be evacuated to the rear. And here is a rare photograph showing guerrillas and Americans working together to bring wounded men to the aid station in the rear. This is what Antipolo looked like after the war. It was very heavily damaged, partly by shelling, partly by bombing, partly by Japanese destruction. These are Filipinos and Americans looking over the Marikina River from the heights of Diliman, probably from Balara, from the Loyola Heights area. The river is very clear, and we can see that this was also a military operational target. Now, apart from the guerrillas, there were also other heroes. They were non-guerrilla heroes. They were not fighting heroes. We have detailed many of the Filipinos who fought as part of the Battle of Manila. But there were also those who did not fight, who did not have arms, but who were heroes in their own way because they tended to the civilians. They tended their wounds, they nursed them, they fed them. And so the doctors and the nurses, frontliners, heroes then, as they are heroes even today, and then food technologists and nutritionists, scientists who were trying to provide alternative food, they were heroes too. We will mention some of them in a little while. There were civic workers as well who refused to leave the city and instead decided to stay to try to help those who were caught in the city. There were others who offered their homes. They were outside the battlefield area, but realizing that their countrymen needed assistance, would offer their homes, would offer food, would open their doors to the less fortunate or to help the U.S. soldiers in whatever way they could. One place where you have these heroes in the medical sector was Philippine General Hospital. Now, Philippine General Hospital was marked by red crosses like this and should not have been part of the fighting. And yet it was in between two military targets. On the one side, the Padre Faura side, you had the University of the Philippines, the old Padre Faura campus. And on the southern side, you would have Japanese strongpoints in the Bureau of Science and in the schools to the other side of PGH. So PGH was caught between two battle sites and as a result suffered a few shells and suffered a few bullets. And some Japanese actually stayed in the hospital trying to seek shelter, trying to hold some of the patients and doctors hostage. But in the end, it was the courage of the doctors and nurses here who saw the day. And special mention should be made of Dr. Antonio Sison, who was then the director of the Philippine General Hospital, and the nurses, the other doctors, and the staff of PGH. Here is Dr. Sison leaving the hospital as the last time as director, because he is retiring when this picture was taken, and the whole hospital staff went out to see him off. But Dr. Sison, his story remains to be told in full. He stayed in the hospital during the war. He cared for the wounded. He cared for the sick as best he could, even if the medicines were in short supply. Tried to find alternative medicines. There was at least one Japanese civilian who was wounded before the fighting, and he made sure that this Japanese civilian was cared for and would not be molested by any of the Filipinos or anybody in the hospital. When the battle neared, Admiral Iwabuchi is said to have told Dr. Sison to shut the doors of PGH. Don't let anyone in, don't let anyone out. But Dr. Sison knew that that would be very catastrophic for the hospital. If people were wounded outside, they had to be brought into the hospital. And people inside the hospital needed to go out to get water, to get whatever food they could, to get anything they could outside to help them survive. So Season disobeyed that order of Admiral Iwabuchi and kept the doors open, as a hospital should be. So Season, even there were a number of medical interns. There was at least one medical intern who was Japanese. He also made sure that this medical intern was protected. And aside from this, Dr. Season made sure that anyone who entered the hospital would be protected. This included residents of the surrounding areas whose homes were destroyed in the fighting. He allowed them in and urged some of them to wear doctor's attire or nurse's attire so the Japanese would not suspect who they were. And thus he saved many more lives than we know he did. So many people owe their lives to Dr. Season and his staff of doctors and nurses. Another doctor worthy of note was Dr. Antonio Hisbert and his wife, Angelica, who was in Intramuros in the thick of the fighting. It turns out that Dr. Hisbert was the last doctor. The others had been killed by the Japanese. He was the only doctor in Intramuros, and it was he who tended to all the wounded as they were brought into San Agustin Church. He didn't have enough bandages, he didn't have enough medicine, he didn't have alcohol, so he had to improvise. For bandages, he had to improvise from clothes of people. Alcohol, he had to use liquor or whatever hard drinks were still around. He had to improvise, and he also saved many lives inside San Agustin Church. There was Dr. Fidel Mundo, the first pediatrician in the Philippines, reportedly the first woman graduate of the Harvard School of Medicine. She came back and became the first full-time pediatrician in the Philippines, specializing in children's diseases. She would put up a children's hospital later on. During the war, she helped the Santo Tomas internees, children of the Santo Tomas internees, by opening a special hospital just for them and catering to their needs. And during the Battle of Manila, she was there also catering not just to children, but to any of the casualties of the war, any of the sick. So she would become a heroine also in the Battle of Manila. These are unnamed nurses, but they came from PGH. Once PGH was secured, the patients and staff had to be moved out as quickly as possible because fighting was still going on in UP Padre Faura and in the schools to the south. So this patient had to be evacuated complete with the hospital bed, and you see a number of nurses looking over the patient, and this was what they had to do. These were all the hospitals in Manila had to be used for the sick and the wounded, and in San Lazaro, these two children were brought in. They were probably parentless by this time. They had lost their parents, and both of them are quite thin because they are malnourished from shortage of food, but the nurses are there taking care of them. This is an interesting picture because it again shows patients from PGH moving outside of PGH towards a safer zone. In this particular case from PGH, this particular patient is being brought to a temporary first aid station in Philippine Women's University, which you see behind. Now, this story says more than it actually looks. The nurse who's pushing the cart, again, there was no other form of transportation, so they have to use this wooden cart. The nurse here, I'm not sure if the spelling of the name is correct, was Nana Vasquez, who was a nurse who served in Bataan. She had been in the hospital in Bataan, and she had endured the fighting, the Bataan campaign. After the Bataan campaign ended, she was released and brought back to Manila. She continued her work in a hospital, and during the battle for Manila, she opened an aid station in PWU. So she's another hero or heroine of that battle, and very few of us remember who she was. Any place that could be turned into a temporary hospital was made into a temporary hospital because the number of patients, casualties, wounded, and sick increased in number as the battle went on. So here is a temporary hospital. This I do not know exactly where this is. This would either be in Malacanang Palace or it might be in a government office around there. The lady who is tending to the casualties of the battle here is Jeronima Pecson, who was secretary to President Jose P. Laurel during the war. Now, she had some first aid training, and she, rather than sit by, also tended to those that she could. Incidentally, she's also famous because she kept Malacanang intact. She did not allow it to be looted, and so all the papers were there as they still are ideally until 1986. So she maintained order together with the remainder of the presidential security, the presidential guard that had remained to guard Malacanang Palace. Jeronima Pecson would become famous after the war as the first woman senator in Philippine political history. Now, not all of the medical staff survived. Many stayed by their posts and they died at their posts. Some of the places where tragedies occurred were the Philippine Red Cross building. This is no longer existing. The Mandaluyong Psychopathic Hospital and Quezon Institute. The staffs of these three medical institutions never left their posts, continued to protect their patients, and many of them died when the Japanese came to kill them. Another person notable in her work during the war was Maria Y. Orosa, food nutritionist who had developed many recipes, among them banana ketchup, alternative foods, alternative methods of cooking, and she had stayed at her post also in the Bureau of Plant and Animal Industry in Manila. Her friends urged her to get out of Manila to save herself, but she said she was responsible for food in Manila. She was responsible for keeping the office open, for helping people cook. And so she stayed and she was killed in the battle. One of the unsung heroes of that battle. Those who survived the fighting in Ermita and Malate had to go somewhere. And most of the central part of Manila was destroyed. They could not cross the Pasig River and go to the northern side of Manila. They could not go to San Lazaro Hospital. So many of them wound up going towards Santa Ana instead. And this is a group of PGH survivors trying to move towards Santa Ana. And it's in Santa Ana that they met people who were very, very sympathetic to their plight. One of the heroes there in Santa Ana was Marshal Lichauco and his wife, Jessie. Now, Jessie Lichauco is still alive. She's over 104 years old, another of the heroines of the Battle of Manila. Her husband and herself opened their house, opened other houses, asked their friends to open their houses in Santa Ana to welcome all of these people who had lost their homes. What little food they had, they tried to give to them. And they mobilized the people in the neighborhood to try to tend to these homeless and starving people. So again, you have these Filipinos without firearms, but serving as heroes in the Battle of Manila. And this is the last slide that I will show. And it just shows the variety of heroes that the Battle of Manila bred. These are Filipinos who proved their worth in 1945. They should be better known, and they should be an inspiration to the present. They show how great Filipinos can be, fighting for their ideals, fighting for fellow Filipinos, fighting for fellow men, giving up all of what they had, sometimes giving up their lives in doing so, but really proving that Filipinos were worth everything in the world. With that, thank you very much for listening, and good day.
Thank you very much for such an informative presentation, sir.
Now, to provide us with further information, let us welcome our second speaker, Ms. Desiree Benipayo. Ms. Desiree Benipayo is currently the Vice President for Research and Education of the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation, which aims to initiate, develop, and carry out the projects and activities that will enlighten the Filipino people, especially the youth, about our World War II history via multimedia platforms. She is also the Secretary of Memorare Manila 1945, an organization which aims to preserve the history of the Battle of Manila and commemorate the memory of more than 100,000 who died during the battle. She also serves as the local tour manager of the National World War II Museum based in New Orleans for their World War II and the Pacific Victory Tours. A fervent advocate of the Philippine history, World War II history holds special place in her heart. It is from this intense interest that she wrote the book Honor, the Legacy of Jose Abad Santos, about our late Chief Justice, whom she considers as one of the greatest Filipino heroes of World War II. Honor was awarded Best Book of Nonfiction Prose in English in the recently concluded 2019 National Book Awards. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Desiree Benipayo.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the PVAO Kagitingan series, and this is the pilot episode. We will be discussing about the Battle of Manila, the events that transpired during the battle, and the heroism of the Filipino people. From February 3 to March 3, 1945, Manila was the scene of the worst urban battle of the Pacific War, now known as the Battle of Manila. The atrocious 29-day battle resulted in the deaths of more than 100,000 non-combatant innocent civilians deliberately murdered by the Japanese. Thousands of homes and buildings, around 80% of Manila, and more than 600 city blocks were razed to the ground. When the guns finally fell silent, the beautiful city of Manila was reduced to rubble and smoldering ash. 4 centuries of history was annihilated as important historical, cultural, and architectural treasures were destroyed forever. In order for us to understand what we lost, we must look back at pre-war Manila. Dubbed as the Pearl of the Orient, it boasted scenic tree-lined boulevards and majestic government buildings. Economy was on the rise, with exports surpassing imports. Transportation and public utilities were excellent, with Manila boasting the longest pier in Asia and the first commercial air flight in the region. Social life was not wanting, as posh and ritzy clubs and dance halls made Manila as cosmopolitan as any other Western capital. It was during this prosperous peacetime period that the war came to the country. On December 8, 1941, Japan attacked the Philippines, and in a matter of days, Manila capitulated. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese army proudly marched into the city to begin their reign of terror. The Second World War brought to an end that glorious era known as peacetime. In the slide, you can see beautiful, beautiful Manila in the 1930s. In fact, the New York Times wrote that Manila is by far the most beautiful city in the Orient. The top of the University Club, it seems half hidden in a canopy of trees, green everywhere, a city within a park. So here in the photo, you can see on the upper right, it's the agriculture and commerce and finance buildings in the Agrifina Circle. And then on the bottom left, that will be the Army Navy Club and the Elks Club. Wala pa yung US Embassy to the right of the Elks Club. The Elks Club is now the Museo Pambata. And then in the middle photo, the Luneta Hotel and the University Club. And across it is the Luneta. And then on the lower right is the beautiful post office building. Beautiful, beautiful Manila. For 3.5 years, the Filipino people endured the hardships of war and prayed for the day that liberation would come. On October 20, 1944, MacArthur and his troops landed on Leyte, and the months-long campaign to retake the Philippines commenced. By January 1945, the US Army landed on Lingayen Gulf and began the advance to Manila. Different Filipino guerrilla groups joined the Americans in retaking the capital. As you can see in the lower right photo, I believe these are the Blue Eagles guerrillas welcoming the American troops, no? And a lot of our guerrillas led the advance to Manila. The Blue Eagles, and then those who helped in the retaking included Huachi guerrillas, the Chinese Filipino guerrillas, Hunters ROTC, PQOG, Markings, and many other. Okay. And in the quote, it says there, the famous quote of General Douglas MacArthur, people of the Philippines, I have returned. All right. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commander of the Manila Naval Defense Force, was determined to fight to the last man. The sinking of his ship, Kirishima, in 1942, brought shame, for he did not go down with his ship and his men. This decisive battle was his chance to regain his honor. He ordered the fortification of buildings and the destruction of bridges. Ammunition, bombs, gasoline, and dynamites were brought to Manila, as well as a supply of food for the Japanese troops, enough to last many months. Landmines were buried in many parts of the city. If you can see in the photo on the left side, the Japanese are already stockpiling food, or rice, and whatever food items. That has also been commandeered or confiscated from our farmers. And then in the middle photo, that's a map of Vito Cruz. You will see a hodgepodge of bombs, explosives, barbed wires, roadblocks that the Japanese used to fortify that area. And then on the right side, you would see that they're getting ready yung kanilang mga machine guns. And I think this is near the government buildings in Manila. Pillboxes, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons secured street intersections. To delay the American advance into the city, overturned vehicles and other heavy equipment were scattered on the roads. It was going to be a fight to the finish. Okay, in this photo, you can see on the left side, those are concrete pillboxes. This was taken near Parañaque to the south because the Japanese believe that a strong American contingent will be coming from the south. And then here in the middle, this for me is a very chilling picture, as you see the people walking by, no? Tapos ayun yung pillbox at the back with a sentry guarding it. So for me parang, basta very chilling tong photo na to for me, as people were just walking by with the, ibig sabihin, there were a lot of that they were kind of naive to that already. And then on the right side is a picture of a Japanese group of troops getting ready. They're inside the pillbox, hunkering down for the battle. Okay, captured Japanese documents in the field clearly show that the atrocities were not random acts of violence, but part of a systematic plan to destroy the city and slaughter its inhabitants. Here are two of the many orders found on captured Japanese soldiers. So one of those orders found was an order of February 8, 1945 from the Manila Naval Defense Force. It says, if the enemy infiltrates, be careful not to lose the opportunity of demolishing and burning buildings. When Filipinos are to be killed, they must be gathered into one place and disposed of with the consideration ammunition and manpower must not be used to excess. Because the disposal of dead bodies is a troublesome task, they should be gathered into houses which are scheduled to be burned or demolished. They should also be thrown into the river. Other battalion order is from the Kobayashi group. It says, the Americans have penetrated Manila with about 1,000 troops and several thousand guerrillas. Even women and children have become guerrillas. All the people on the battlefield, with the exception of Japanese military personnel, will be put to death. So as you see, they were ordered to do the massacres. Those were just not wanton or random acts of violence, but a systematic systematic approach to the slaughter of the Manileños at the time. February 3, 1945 will be the start of the darkest period in the history of Manila. The Japanese started torching and detonating buildings in the commercial and financial district of Binondo and Escolta. People fled as building after building exploded, and as the fires and the heat intensified. Manila turned into a raging inferno. With no more electricity and running water, there was no way to stop the fires. In the slides, you can see Binondo on the upper right, Binondo area burning. The lower left, fleeing their homes, carrying what little belonging they can carry with them. Then the lower right, you see a Filipino guerrilla leading the advance to Manila. And then Marshal Lichauco wrote in his diary, which he published in his book, Mother Putnam, He says that thick clouds enveloped the city, that daytime was as dark as night. In Intramuros, the gates were sealed shut as early as February 4, 1945, trapping all residents inside. The Japanese began pulling out young women and started raping them to the agony of the powerless parents. The men, 14 years old and up, were marched to Fort Santiago, where they would all be tortured and killed. Intramuros was put to the torch, and people suffocated from the acrid smoke. If you see the lower right photo, you'll see Manila Cathedral blasted. So on the eve of February 5th or 6th, the Japanese rigged explosives inside Manila Cathedral, and with a very, very large and catastrophic explosion, the cathedral exploded, and then its iconic dome collapsed. So kaya ang natira na lang is like just the skeleton. No? Intramuros was, especially Fort Santiago, was the site of daily massacres, the dungeons. In the dungeons, the men were tortured, gasoline were poured into the dungeons, enough just to wet their feet, and lighted match were thrown in. So it was a very slow death. In fact, I read a book which said the lucky ones were shot or bayoneted because it was an easier death. The rest were burned slowly to death or starved to death. There was a dungeon that the Americans discovered where they saw that the bodies were not burned, they were not shot, they were not bayoneted, but all were dead because of starvation. And when the men were almost ubos, the Japanese came for the women and the children. So the women and the children, especially, they were staying in the Santo Domingo, Colegio Santa Rosa area because those were ruins from the first bombings in December 1941. So since all of the area in Binondo was put to the torch, in Intramuros was put to the torch, they had no place to go but these ruins, and they would get whatever, scrap, hierro, or wood just to have a roof over their head. No, so the women and the children hid there, and then the Japanese came from them, marched them by twos or by threes, and started bayoneting them, women and children. So they were not content with killing just the men, but came for the women and children as well. Outside the ancient city, the massacres also began. People who hid in their homes or air raid shelters were killed, and those who were able to escape were met with flamethrowers or machine guns. In Malate, the Japanese troops rounded up the residents and took them to St. Paul's College and herded them into a big dining hall. Inside, the chandeliers, rigged with explosives, were set off, killing hundreds in an instant. After the deafening explosions, half-mangled bodies and body parts lay everywhere. Survivors who escaped the carnage were greeted with machine guns, grenades, and bayonets as they run to the streets, with the murderers laughing and giggling as they finish the survivors off. Babies were forced from their mothers' arms and skewered by bayonets. The troops returned to the hall, scavenged for any valuables that the dead still had on, and burned the room. In the Ermita area, around 2,000 residents were marched to Plaza Ferguson. The men were brought to the Manila Hotel and the women to Bayview Hotel. Young women were raped mercilessly until their private parts bled. Mothers and older women tried to shield the young girls, and some Russian prostitutes even offered themselves to spare the young girls. Elsewhere, the fires engulfed the city. Anyone who wandered outside were sniped at by Japanese Marines, holed up in pillboxes. The Holocaust continued for days. There were massacres on every street, every corner. The streets were also filled with mines, and as a result, mangled bodies, arms, and body pieces littered the streets or were left hanging on trees. In many instances, the Japanese used women and children as human shields and even strapped a young girl to a supplies truck to prevent the Americans from firing. I remember one of our members in Memorare, Tita Isabel, Caro Wilson, she was at the Bayview Hotel. She was around 14 or 15 at the time. And then she was telling me that the Japanese were shouting, "Daraga, Daraga," because they wanted dalagas. And they looked for really pretty, maputi-puti daw na women. So she was singled out. Tita Isabel was pretty, and medyo, for a 14-year-old, she was already medyo plump and developed at the time. So the Japanese pulled her out and said, "Daraga, daraga." So si Tita Isabel was bright enough, was alert enough to say, "No, no, married, married." And then the Japanese parang pinakawalan siya kasi parang nagalit daw na bakit siya married, something like that. And it was Tita Isabel who told me about the Russian prostitutes who were also brought to the Bayview Hotel. And they were heroes, Tita Isabel said, because they protected us young girls, although not all, but they were able to protect some young girls from being raped by offering themselves instead. No? So, sabi nga Tita Isabel, thanks to these Russian prostitutes, maraming na-save na Filipinas. And then another member of Memorare, si Tito Jimmy Wilson, Jimmy Litton told me this story that they lived in Isaac Peral, which is now UN Avenue. And he said that yung father niya said they had to leave the house because all the houses were being burned or being stormed into by the Japanese. So they had to run outside onto the direction of PGH. And I remember he told me that their housemaid was running in front of him. So takbo sila, parang one column. And then their housemaid stepped on a mine. And he said, "I cannot forget how I saw a person na hati daw sa kalahati." So talaga daw putol yung body. Sabi niya, he cannot forget that ever. And then we have another member, Carlos Perez Rubio. So his grandfather's house in Vito Cruz. So ito yon, the lower right photo, that's their house in Vito Cruz. So many of their neighbors went to inside their house to hide from the Japanese. Kasi since many of the big houses were concrete, so parang medyo konting may fortress-like feeling inside, no? Hindi basta-basta siya masisira. So a lot of the neighbors went inside, and then the Japanese came and stormed in and killed the people inside. So there were 28 massacred there. So if you see some of the pictures here, on the upper right is St. Paul's College, yung kaninang diniscuss ko, where the residents of Malate were brought there, and then the chandeliers were rigged by the Japanese with explosives, and then they set it off. And eyewitness accounts said that the explosion was so big that it tore a hole on the wall, so big that a truck can come in. Ganun kalaki, ganun kalakas yung explosion. They estimate that around 600 to 700 died at St. Paul's College. And then the Bayview Hotel here on the middle right, this is the site where many of the young women were raped. The German Club, this is a very sad story, where around 1,500 at least were massacred. And the ironic thing was people from that area ran to the German Club because the Germans were allies with the Japanese. So they were thinking that since it was the German Club, that they'll be protected. In fact, the manager of the German Club, Mr. Martin Ohaus, protected the people inside by talking to the Japanese, but the Japanese did not listen to him and stabbed him. So namatay siya. And then the Japanese, started stabbing people inside, even nursing mothers who pleaded for their lives. They stabbed them, then started to torch the German Club. Around 1,500 dead there. And then on the lower left, you see Philippine Red Cross. Wala na ngayon tong building na ito. This is the corner of the then Isaac Peral, which is now UN Avenue. So if I'm not mistaken, baka ito yung site of Manila Medical now. Not so sure, but it probably is, no? And here also, kahit the Red Cross siya, the Japanese stormed in, killed everyone inside, including the doctors and the nurses. There was a survivor in Philippine Red Cross, and siya yung naging star witness during the war crimes trials. She was an actress then, known as Corazon Noble. So medyo kilala siya, and she shielded her baby, kakanak lang niya. But then the bayonet, the Japanese stabbed her, lumusot yung bayonet sa baby. It was a miracle that even Corazon, survived this. So when she was a witness during the war crimes trials, nakabalot kasi ang dami niyang sugat dito sa arms niya, bayonet wounds. Okay. Showbiz, yung si Corazon Noble, she would be the mom of Jay Ilagan. Kung kilala pa ng younger generation ngayon si Jay Ilagan, no? And she lived to I think she's still alive, but I know na medyo matanda na siya the last article that I read about her. But yun nga, she was the star witness in the war crimes trials, no, that brought justice to the survivors. And then the lower middle would be the De La Salle University. There you see the pockmarks. And at De La Salle, around 40 plus civilians and 16 La Salle brothers died. And this was horrendous, as a lot of them were, pretending to be dead. Para hindi na sila i-bayonet, no? They were pretending to be dead. But the Japanese were playing with them and were mocking them, looted them. So what the Japanese did was to put a glass of water beside the ones that they suspected were still alive, no? So they put a glass of water and they would come back after a few hours and see kung kaninong baso yung nabawasan ng water, meaning the person next to it is still alive and drank some water. And then they would torture, kill that person slowly. So that was the sad thing about the battle, is that a lot of the survivors said that the Japanese were laughing. The worst part is that Japanese were laughing and mocking the dead. Okay. And many residences in the Ermita, Malate area, Paco, all of those houses became slaughterhouses. As many from 10, 20 to as much as 120 were killed inside these houses. In Singalong, the Singalong church, there were several priests and nuns who were hung inside the church. And the sad part was their hands were even tied at the back. So wala nang ang laban, hinang pa. And then in Singalong, the famous 1195 Singalong Street became a beheading station where many, many men were beheaded by the Japanese. And at the same time as the German club massacres were happening, many in the Paco area were rounded up, 14 to 65 years old. They were promised food in exchange for labor, but then they were just brought to this estero. Pangalan na estero near that is Estero de Tripagalina, which is bitukan ng manok, no? Tripagalina. And there they were shot and some of them beheaded. So you see, fina-follow talaga nila yung command, no? Kasi kanina, if you remember, in one of the captured orders, they said that the Filipinos can also be thrown in the rivers. Ganyan. So makita natin na there were many mass na dinala sila sa mga estero at doon binarel. Okay. Also in Paco, in Dart Street, there were at least 4 mass graves there. So for that day alone, the same time as the German club massacres, either Feb 9 or Feb 10, around 400 people were killed in Paco alone, and in the German club around 1,500 at least. Another site of grabbing massacre was the Spanish consulate. So during the war, allies yan, no? Although Spain was neutral, we know naman at the time na, di ba, si Franco was, rightist, fascist. So allies yan. So hindi ginagalaw ng Japanese yung mga Germans, mga Spanish dito. But it was a different story during the battle. In fact, the guard who was manning the gate of the Spanish consulate, he even held a Spanish flag. Parang sabihin sa mga troops na, no, parang we're supposed to be friends, we're supposed to be allies. But wala, hindi pinakinggan. They stormed the Spanish consulate, massacred a lot of people, and only one survivor, 8-year-old Angela, I forgot her surname, but she was the only survivor of the massacre at the Spanish consulate. Last year, we had our 75th year anniversary. We had a symposium of the Battle of Manila, and we were very fortunate to have Spanish author Alvaro del Castaño. He wrote the book Muerte en Manila, and he was able to discuss with us because his grandfather was then the Spanish consul general here, during the massacre. So he had a lot of materials on that, and he interviewed people, including the 8-year-old survivor who now lives in Barcelona, and he was there to share with us. And it was sad that after the Battle of Manila, that was when a lot of Spanish families left Manila or left the Philippines for good. So there were 2 ships sent by Spain, and ayun, nagsiuwian sila. So the ironic thing was, it was not the Philippine Revolution or the Spanish American War that made the Spanish families leave. It was the Battle of Manila. And after the war, Spain severed diplomatic ties with Japan, only to resume it years after. There were a lot of other places where massacres happened. In the Malate Church, the Irish Columban priests, 4 of them, and many others hiding inside the church were killed. In the Vincentian Seminary, 6 priests and a lot of residents hiding inside were also killed. The Ateneo College in Padre Faura, at least 100 died there. The Scottish Rite Temple in PGH. So the 7,000 people inside PGH was held hostage by the Japanese as they fortified PGH and made it into like a sniper nest, no? So the Americans had a hard time retaking PGH because the Japanese, I was told, would wear doctor's uniform. So nahirapan sila to distinguish who's the enemy, ganyan. And at night, the sad part was at night, the Japanese would, take the women and rape them inside PGH. The UP Manila was the scene of ferocious fighting between the Americans and the Japanese. It was bloody, room by room, floor by floor. And then when night came, so the Americans were also inside the building, so they were just quiet there. Then in the wee hours of the morning, they heard the Japanese singing. They broke into song. And then after the song, bursts of explosions were heard as they committed suicide. So the following day, they saw 77 Japanese dead. And then one of the saddest atrocities also was the massacre of 125 sick and elderly men, including very old Spanish priests, in Intramuros. This was near the corner of Luna and Aduana sa may Plaza Roma, if you're familiar with that. So what happened was, the men 14 years old to 65 years old were already moved to Fort Santiago, as we discussed earlier. So nearing the end of the war, hindi pa na-content yung Japanese. So they got all the older than 65-year-old men, which were the very old priests, sickly, They got them from the San Agustin, which became like an aid station, and marched them to Plaza Roma and put them all in this bomb shelter. And then they just threw grenades inside. Okay, so a lot of people died, but there were still survivors. What the Japanese Marines did was, on the next day, they came back and then poured sand on the ventilation shaft of the bomb shelter to ensure that no one survives. So, but there was one survivor, Father Jose Barullo, and in his deposition, he said that the worst part is that you can hear the Japanese laughing. Okay, now we go to the last stand. So by late February, the Americans were able to retake parts of the city. And by February 23rd, Intramuros was liberated. The American troops were shocked by the barbarity and the horrible massacre scenes they saw inside Intramuros. With Intramuros taken, the Japanese hunkered down in the government buildings across Intramuros. An estimated 700 Marines under Iwabuchi's command were left. 300 inside the legislative building, 200 in the agriculture building, and another 200 in the finance building. So Iwabuchi ordered his men, if we run out of bullets, we will use grenades. If we run out of grenades, we will cut down the enemy with our swords. If we break our swords, we will kill them by sinking our teeth in their throats. So it was really a fight to the death. The Americans broadcast to the Japanese to surrender, but no reply came as the grace period of 30 minutes ticked away. Bloody, room by room, floor by floor fighting ensued over the next days. American artillery blasted the buildings. As the situation worsened for the Japanese, Iwabuchi knew the end was near. He called his men and said, if anyone has the courage to escape, do so. If not, please take your lives here. It was clear that surrender was not an option. Iwabuchi, the butcher of Manila, decided to end his life and slit open his belly. American artillery continued to pound the buildings until the last of the enemy troops were annihilated. On March 3, the Battle of Manila was finally over. When the guns fell silent, survivors started searching for their loved ones amid the city's debris and ruins. Many would have no closure as family members were bulldozed into mass graves. Fattened flies feasting on the dead became so thick they showed up in aerial photos. What were once homes were now nothing but wreck and ruin. Japanese fire and American artillery had transformed the Pearl of the Orient into a wasteland, the most devastated city in the Pacific. This was the price of Manila's liberation. The war brought colossal damage and destruction to lives and property. Figures running to the billions were calculated to provide a quantifiable estimation of damages to infrastructure and industries. But the psychological and moral damage to the Filipino people remain incalculable. Manila, as the world once knew it, will never be the same again. No victory parade can ever restore it to its former glory. It is now 75 years since the dust of war has settled, and let not the war memory of the nation fade. For what purpose did the unarmed civilians and brave soldiers perish, if not to teach us that no side ever wins a war? It is our duty to remember. This is the memorial in Intramuros. I would like to share to you what is written on the epitaph. It says, "This memorial is dedicated to all those innocent victims of war, many of whom went nameless and unknown to a common grave, or never even knew a grave at all, their bodies having been consumed by fire or crushed to death beneath the rubble of ruins. Let this monument be the gravestone for each and every one of the over 100,000 men, women, and children and infants allied in Manila during this Battle of Liberation, February 3 to March 3, 1945. We have not forgotten them, nor shall we ever forget. May they rest in peace as part now of the sacred ground of this city, the Manila of our affections." With this, I end my presentation. Thank you and good day to all.
Thus, Ms. Desiree Benipayo. Now let us hear from Ms. Felici Lois Lanya for the question and answer portion of this episode.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I am Felice Lois Lanya, and I will be joining you for the Q&A portion of our webinar. So without further ado, we now open the floor for the questions from the audience and the public. For our FB viewers, again, please place your questions on the comment section. And for the Zoom participants, please place your questions on our chat box. And also please indicate as well to whom you would like your questions be addressed. So we already have a couple of questions here. So let me read the first one. This is addressed to, this is for Dr. Jose from Alfred or Alfred Young. Dr. Jose, is it safe today to do away with the Western narrative that they are the heroes? If so, what would be the best way to bring honor to our national unsung heroes?
I see the point that is raised there, and it's becoming quite popular that we have to have more voices of the Filipinos and especially our Filipino heroes. But I think we cannot do away with the Western narrative because the Americans did have the necessary force to defeat the Japanese in a military sense. So it was really a close collaboration. It was a close cooperation between the Americans and the Filipinos that won the battle. I don't think we could have won it ourselves. The Americans would probably have had more difficulty if the Filipinos had not sided with them. So it's really a collaborative effort. But I think if you read the American histories, the official histories, and popular histories, and they continue to be written even now, very few of them really bring out the Filipino side. And if the Filipino side is brought out, it's usually the victim mentality that they were raped, they were attacked by the Japanese, they were victims of the atrocities and the massacres. It's when I was doing my own work that I found out that there were so many heroes in the Battle of Manila, and with much of the Philippine the Philippine experience in World War II that have not really been given appropriate attention. And the US government actually has a medal for some of the civilians. Since they are not military, the civilians who helped Americans were given what was called the Medal of Freedom. And these medals were given right after the war, 1946 to 1948. But we don't have a comprehensive list of this. I don't know how many were awarded these. I come across several names, but the Medal of Freedom is only awarded to Filipinos who were civilians. I think one thing would be to look into who these were, who the nurses were, who the doctors were, who the civic workers were. They should be brought out into the limelight. They should be given appropriate recognition. There used to be a number of memorials. I think in the case of Colaiko, there's a memorial to him in Pasay. It's near where he was born, but very few of us know it's there. I was there when it was unveiled, but there are these small ones. There used to be a memorial to Colaiko inside UST, but in the development of the campus, that memorial disappeared. Ateneo also had, because Colaiko was an Ateneo alumnus, there was a Colaiko Hall, but in the modernization of the campus here in Loyola Heights, that Colaiko Hall disappeared and it became instead a Colaiko wing. I think it's a small part and very few people know who he was. So I think it's really high time, and I think PVAO and Veterans Bank should be applauded for their efforts to bring these voices, these unknown heroes, to the public's attention. I think there should be more attention to this. There used to be an essay writing contest that the Veterans Bank and Manila Philippine Daily Inquirer had, asking young people to look for these unknown heroes. And the winners of this competition would be published in Daily Inquirer. And the idea was to eventually put them together in book form. So there are so many of these stories. It's really so exciting to read about these unsung heroes. They come from all over the Philippines. They come from all walks of life, different regions, different religions. They have to be given attention. So I think perhaps even in the educational system, maybe assignments can be given in the Philippine history classes. Look for your unknown heroes in your particular barangay or your town, because there are so many of them. And I think if these are documented, then we are in step one of trying to bring them from obscurity into recognizing who they are.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jose. Okay, our next question. All right, so Dr. Jose, both Dr. Jose and Ms. Benipayo talked about how the Battle of Manila was the scene of the worst urban fighting in the Pacific Asia or Pacific theater. So if Manila was declared an open city, it says here in the question, if Manila was declared an open city, how come that during the liberation the city experienced heavy destruction? Okay, let's have Ms. Benipayo for this question.
Hi, Miss Lana. Contrary to the question, in December 1941, MacArthur declared Manila an open city so that Manila will be spared from any destruction by the Japanese. But still, they still bombed. Many parts of Intramuros were destroyed at the time. But in 1945, Yamashita did not declare Manila an open city. That's the main difference. In fact, the Americans thought that it's just going to be a breeze. They thought that Yamashita would declare Manila an open city. They did not even foresee that, there will be ferocious fighting. So it could have spelled a lot of difference but again, this is a could have or another what if situation, no? But hindi dineclare ni Yamashita na open city yung Manila at that time. Hence the destruction.
Thank you very much.
I hope I answered the question.
Very well said, ma'am. Thank you po.
Okay, I can add a little more perhaps. No, President Laurel, who was in Manila in December 1944, did realize that Manila might become a battleground, and he did plead with Yamashita to declare Manila an open city. Of course, Laurel was rushed to Baguio towards the end of the month, and he no longer had control of Manila after that. But Yamashita's excuse was that he did not have the power to declare Manila an open city. Unlike in 1941, MacArthur and Quezon were both in Manila at that time. They were the supreme authority in Manila at that time. Yamashita stated that he had to appeal to Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters, because he himself did not have the authority to do that. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. But anyway, he refused to declare Manila an open city, and because of that, the fighting did take place.
Thank you very much, also Dr. Jose. So, in connection with that, let's now talk about the destruction that happened in the city of Manila. So, earlier, Dr. Jose said that there were cultural heritages, relics that were destroyed. So, can you give us a enumeration of other cultural heritages that were destroyed during the Battle of Manila, Dr. Jose?
Well, almost all the churches. No, we've seen the picture of Manila Cathedral, the old Ateneo campus in Intramuros that was totally destroyed. That's why after the war, there was almost nothing to start with. The Philippine National Library, which was housed in the Legislative Building. Now, you see pictures of the Legislative Building totally destroyed. Everything in the Philippine National Library was destroyed. All the manuscripts, all the rare documents, all the rare books. I think one of the losses that we had, for example, was one of the very few surviving issues of Kalayaan, the Katipunan's newspaper in 1896, the newspapers of the Revolution of 1898. Those were burned. A lot of private collections. Many of the important people in Manila at that time lived in central Manila, Ermita Malate. There was no Forbes Park. New Manila, there were some people there already. Cubao was non-existent at the time. There was no Makati yet. So all of these people had their own private collections. They had stamp collections, they had coin collections, the Spanish documents of the Tabacalera library. Those all went up in smoke. So all of these were irreplaceable. And all the churches, except San Agustin Church, all of them in Intramuros were destroyed. That meant all their papers went up as well. UP, University of the Philippines, Padre Faura, that was almost totally destroyed. The library was a total loss. So you read after the war, they're appealing to students who had not returned their books because classes were suspended, that please return your books. And that's where the library started after the war.
There you go. Thank you, sir. And this one, I think it's still in connection with that question po. No? As part of beautification and, okay, hold on for a second. As part of the beautification and heritage preservation efforts, the city government of Manila expressed its interest in rehabilitating several historical landmarks in the city. Now, being a bastion of historical narratives of the hold on for a second. I lost the question. Okay, so I think let's just move on to another one here. So how do the attempts to rehabilitate World War II historical landmarks at present time change the very essence of reviving its historical significance with the inception of political motives? Dr. Jose.
Well, one thing that I was kind of sad to see was, when Intramuros was restored in the 1970s, prior to the restoration of Intramuros, there was so much that you could actually go to the walls of Intramuros and see all of the shell holes. I once went on top of the walls of Intramuros and I picked up some pre-war bottles there. And so, I think you could have found bullet slugs on top of Intramuros. And now, of course, it's very clean. So Intramuros administration in cleaning up Intramuros was able to collect a lot of artifacts. However, I think these are not open to the public at large. So I think if they make these available, it would make people more interested. There are still a few holes in some walls of Intramuros, and I think those should be kept as is because those tell the stories. So in Fort Santiago, for example, some of the buildings have not been repaired just to show how damaged it was. The bodies of people recovered in Fort Santiago are still buried there. It's an anonymous cemetery with a large white cross. I think people should perhaps be instructed to look into these little, should be encouraged to look into these. There are other parts of the city of Manila which have remained intact. Remember that picture that I showed of Rizal Avenue with the onlookers and the uh, men and women in that house in Mayhalige corner, Rizal Avenue. Those houses still stand. Now you can't get that same view today because the LRT blocks the view now, but those houses are still there. And many years ago, I actually walked down that area and began talking to some people there, and they were there in 1945. And it was so amazing to realize that after 30, 40, 50 years, they were still there where it all happened. So I think I think we should be more aware of what are still left and try to preserve some of them. A lot of modernization means letting go of the past, but I think there's a creative way of preserving some of these. One sad part of Manila that I see is the remains of Paco Station. Now, all you have left of that now is the facade. And I think the story was that it's going to be torn down and a mall was going to be put up in its place. I felt very sad about that because Paco Station was a major station before the war. It was a beautiful railroad station. And that's where so much fighting took place. As I mentioned, a Medal of Honor was won there. Filipinos fought there. Now it's so sad to see it. I think that can perhaps be rehabilitated a little bit and something about what happened there might be mentioned.
That's right, sir. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think I now see the question earlier. So I think this is addressed to Ms. Benipayo. So ma'am, as part of the beautification and heritage preservation efforts, now the city government of Manila expressed its interest in rehabilitating several historical landmarks in the city. Now being a bastion of historical narratives of the Filipinos from the beginning of time, what could be the pros and cons of these initiatives? Or are there any cons at all?
I actually applaud the efforts of the city of Manila in rehabilitating many of the historical spots. No? I cannot think of any uh, cons unless they try to remove history in it. No, but I think they're doing a good job. Intramuros administration is doing a very good job. Now, if you go to Intramuros, there are signs, diba, that tell you what this site was before. This was the Jesuit convent before, or this was Colegio Santa Rosa before. And actually, the sad part there is when you look at most of those signs, halos lahat nung signs na yun would say that the building ceased to exist in 1945. Talagang meaning the Battle of Manila razed Intramuros to the ground. And siguro add ko na rin yung kaninang question na what were yung cultural losses during the battle. I think with Intramuros razed to the ground, which was when you say Manila, at that time, Intramuros was Manila, di ba, during the Spanish period. 400 years of century, annihilated by a single battle. It's so sad. So that's why we have to revive na itong ang efforts na to to let our public, our youth know yung importance ng Manila, what happened before. Our youth knows a lot about other countries, especially, but sometimes our own history, nakakalimutan na. So, yun. Thank you, Ms. Lana.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Ito po, wala pong specific na speaker kung sino gusto niyang tanungin. Pero ito po yung question, anong program po ba sa kasalukuyan ang binibigay sa mga veterano at sa mga unknown heroes na ito, na lalo na ngayon tinanggal ang Philippine history sa high school at ito ay hinati pa sa grade 5 and grade 6. Para sana until now, kilala sila ng mga Generation Z or tinatawag po nating Gen Z. Now, teacher po kasi ako. Okay, I'm so sorry. Hold on for a second. Teacher po kasi ako sa history at nakakalungkot na most students now, di na sila maalam sa ating kasaysayan, lalo na po sa World War II na talagang nangyari sa ating bansa. So, Dr. Jose, you first?
Yeah. Okay, so mga programa. No? As I mentioned earlier, there was once a program by Philippine Veterans Bank, kasama din yung Daily Inquirer. Magaganda sana yung premyo nito. And in fact, ang daming sumama sa competition na ito. And it really brought out mga local heroes natin. because not only the student would benefit from this, pero pati yung school niya sa mga awards. Unfortunately, hindi niyata natuloy yun. But I think Philippine Veterans Affairs Office is trying to put up some programs also para mas makilala natin ang mga veteranong ito. There are also a series of documentaries on some of our veterans. Ito ay mapapanood sa YouTube. Yung problema yata sa elementary school is paano ito masisingit sa curriculum kasi medyo tight na tight yung curriculum nga sa kasaysayan. Pwede siguro ito i-assign as extracurricular project. Panoorin nyo itong mga documentaries. There are some very good ones actually that have come out recently on Battle of Manila or yung mga hunters sa ROTC guerrillas. Pwede nilang mapanood ito online sa YouTube. And then they can realize na ganito pala yung mga kabataan natin noon. Siguro sila yung mga Gen Z noon, panahon na yun. So that's one way kasi especially very visual ito, no? It's not yung traditional lecture type but more very visual yung presentation. So baka pwedeng i-recommend sa kanila itong mga documentaries na ito.
Thank you, sir. What about you, Ma'am Desiree?
I like the question so much because that's what our foundation is trying to do. No, privately we produced the movie Honor: The Legacy of Jose Abad Santos, who was one of the greatest unknown heroes of World War II. So ito na, no, unknown, unsung. People know him. People know of him, but not about him. No, alam nila this Jose Abad Santos. LRT station or that man in the 1,000 peso bill, di ba? Pero pag magtanong ka ng high school, even college graduate, baka hindi ka masagot kung sino pa siya at bakit siya naging hero, right? So we produced this film with the hope of showing this to schools. And we have been successful in showing this to many schools. And we are being programmed in the grade 6 level. So sadly, dati yung history is in high school, right? Now DepEd moved it to the grades 5 and 6 levels, which I think is too young, di ba? At grades 5, memorize lang sila ng memorize. Hindi nila iniintindi kung ano ba yung story. And I'm thankful that Ma'am, the one who sent the question, is very worried about this, no? Kasi nga, hindi pwede puro lang classroom lecture and stuff. So what we offer to the schools is we screen Honor to the kids, and then yung buhay kasi ni Jose Abad Santos encompass ng maraming periods. He was born during the Spanish colonial period, during the Philippine-American War and the Philippine Revolution. He acted as a young courier. He was 10, 12 years old. And then he was part of our government during the Commonwealth. And then he was martyred during World War II. So, ang daming napanood nung bata. And the teachers are also grateful to us after screening kasi sabi niya, they have now more a grasp. Kasi visual yung mga bata ngayon visual na. Hindi mo pwedeng biglang ng libro yan, di ba? Like our textbooks din, wala pa minsan pictures, di ba? Noong 1970s and ano. But now they have to be very visual. And you know what? When we screen this in schools, we do a Q&A after to process the kids' thoughts. No? Kasi marami silang katanungan, even at 11, 12 years old. And I said, you know what? Sabi niya, I have a deeper sense of patriotism now, sabi niya. Bumalik daw yung patriotism. So I was quite surprised. Bumalik, ibig sabihin nawala at one point, and now bumalik because of the movie. Parang kasi the movie will make you feel proud to be a Filipino. It's not just about the life of Jose Abad Santos, but you feel proud to be a Filipino. So for all the teachers out there, social studies teachers or history college teachers, pwede niyo po kaming i-email or i-message Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation, and you can screen the movie to you, no? Sumusulat po kasi kami sa mga principals, pero marami po kasing principals na siguro sa kabisihan, hindi na kami binabalikan. So, but the schools which we have shown this to have really appreciated it, and we even give teachers other materials to enhance how they will teach grade 6 students about the war. Ang hirap kasi, di ba, grade 6, tapos you talk about, horrendous things and such. So we can help the teachers, create a two. Alam ko maikli lang yung World War II in the grade 6, maybe 2 to 3 sessions. That's what they told me, no? They even spent a longer time for martial law. So I think we have to go back to World War II because dun makikita yung kagitigan din ng kabataan at the time. So for all the teachers out there looking for materials, you can contact us and we can help you enhance your World War II curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That's right. That's very important, lalo na po sabi niyo nga po sa mga kabataan natin ngayon na halos wala na po talagang naaalala or alam tungkol po sa ating history. Okay, so on to our next question. I think this is for Dr. Jose from Jose Carlo Ibabaw. So since De La Salle has been also a massacre site during liberation, did also the same massacre take place in UST?
Not in UST, no? Kasi UST at that time was used as an internment camp for American civilians. Kaya this was the top priority of the US Army, the 1st Cavalry Division, to rescue the American internees before a massacre could take place in Santo Tomas internment camp. Now, UST and Letran or La Salle are quite different. No? UST was, of course, a different campus. La Salle was a campus at that time, but it was also a well-built building, reinforced concrete, and it was a place where many refugees sought shelter. Kasi most of the La Salle fathers or brothers at that time were mostly German or Germanic of German descent, and so they felt that they would be protected there. And the buildings seemed so strong that they felt they would be safe. But there was a Japanese garrison in that area, and they really deliberately decided to kill everyone in it, including the brothers, the La Salle brothers. So UST was quite different. Now, other universities, La Salle, Letran was not holding class, but most of Letran was destroyed. UST campus in Intramuros was closed by that time. It was no longer holding class. Part of it had been damaged when the war started. UP, not really a massacre because the Japanese took over the UP buildings earlier on. It's the other schools that you have the massacres, no? St. Paul's College, Santa Teresa College. It's there that you also have other massacres take place.
Thank you. Now another question. Now this is from Patrick John Tabar. I think he's one of our Facebook viewers. This is addressed to Ms. Des. Is the Bayview that is standing right now in front of the U.S. Embassy the same Bayview Hotel where the rapes occurred?
Sadly, yes, Patrick. So it is the same. It has a marker there now, a historical marker, but it doesn't tell about of course, the rapes and the atrocities. It is the same spot. Yes.
It's the same spot, but it's a different building.
Yeah.
The building has been renovated, so it's quite different from what it was in 1940, but it's the same spot, exactly the same spot.
Yes. Okay. Additional question, Dr. Jose and Ms. Benipayo, you said that that's the exact spot, no? Pero it signifies kasi it's a historical landmark somehow, but it signifies yung ibig niyang kasing sabihin hindi ganun kaganda because it's where the rapes occur. Do you think it's also important for us to actually parang maglagay din ng landmark to say or to show kung ano yung nangyari doon even if hindi naman siya even if masaklap yung nangyari sa lugar na yon?
Commercially speaking, baka hindi payagan ng owners. Siguro, well, in the line of remembering what happened, it would have been nice, but I think siguro kaya hindi na nila sinama because syempre it's a commercial enterprise, di ba? So no customer might might check in pag nabasa yun.
Maybe some out of the way corner, or maybe in the if there's a chapel there, maybe it can be put there. So La Salle, for example, in the chapel, there is a marker there. I don't know who stopped to read it, but it's there. Where else do you have this? Manila Hotel was also a massacre site. There's nothing to that effect there. But if you read the history of Manila Hotel, there's a book about it. It mentions that. So maybe someone should write a book about Bayview and then pwede dong ipasok.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that. So another question from one of our Zoom participants from Ray Carolina. What kind of limelight or attention are in the process to research whether there were some Japanese comfort women who probably helped guerrillas or U.S. soldiers to defeat the Japanese? So we are talking about our Japanese comfort women. No specific speakers, so I guess Ms. Benipayo, you can answer this question.
I haven't come across any books or narratives that speak of Japanese comfort women during the Battle of Manila. But major related is that we had prostitutes inside Intramuros, no, who were really helpful. Kanina, if you remember the talk of Dr. Jose about Dr. Hisbert, and he made San Agustin like an aid station, no, like a mini hospital. So in his what do you call this, in his testimonies after the war, Dr. Hisbert said that, kanina banggit din ni Dr. Hosena, he doesn't have bandages, he doesn't have alcohol, di ba? It was actually the prostitutes of Intramuros who helped him secure this stuff. So the prostitutes, he would say, I need alcohol for a while, and then come back with gin, bandages that they would get from the Japanese troops, no? So I mean, very, sila talaga unsung heroes, right? Parang they offer themselves so that they can get this, not for themselves, but for the victims, diba? And also, Dr. Hisbert said during the daytime, he would see the prostitutes helping bury the dead. Kasi nagkalat na talaga yung patay, di ba? So, I guess yun nga yung ganda ng humanity comes out even in times of carnage. So yun lang naman yung alam ko about, but I haven't come across narratives on Japanese comfort women. Maybe Dr. Jose?
Well, about Japanese comfort women, that's an unknown side, really. There were Filipino comfort women of the Japanese. There were Korean comfort women of the Japanese, but there were also Taiwanese and Japanese comfort women as part of that whole system. Now, I think most of the Japanese women were taken up to Baguio, and they were there in Baguio and northern Luzon as part of Yamashita's forces. And some of them, since they could not ply their trade in the mountain province, they were asked to serve as nurses. But one of the staff officers of General Yamashita wrote in his memoirs that, these are former prostitutes, they're comfort women, and they're trying to go back to their trade. And so to have put them in nurses' uniforms kind of demeans the nurses' reputation, because you have these people. But there's really very little on the Japanese comfort women, and there were quite a number. Now, if they helped the guerrillas, I don't know. The Filipino comfort women, I think, did. Those who could escape, or those who were helped by the guerrillas to escape, they did help the guerrillas.
Thank you very much for that. But should there be more narratives about them po?
Oh yeah, I think there should be more. It's really a very unknown story. The Koreans have documented it fairly well. The Japanese, they had, no, but I know a Japanese organization trying to document that, but I don't know if they got any narratives from the Japanese.
Thank you very much, sir. So another question for you po, Dr. Jose. This is from Mike Banos, one of our Facebook viewers. Now, did the Japanese reparations after the war go to restoring the buildings which were destroyed during the Battle of Manila 1945?
No. We look at two aid packages after the war. One is U.S. rehabilitation aid, which was passed by U.S. Congress very soon after the war in 1945. That provided money to reconstruct basically infrastructure of the government, the piers, the ports, the airports, government buildings. So all of the major government buildings in Manila, you will find a plaque there saying rebuilt with U.S. or American rehabilitation funds. Even UP in Diliman was constructed by rehabilitation funds. Now, the Japanese reparations money was a long drawn out affair. The Japanese never wanted to pay it because they said we were also damaged by the war. We lost so much during the war. And while the Philippine government tried to push very hard for this, the Japanese were unwilling to pay. Eventually, when they paid, it was a fraction of what the Philippine government asked. And that payment was a government-to-government deal. It did not involve trickling down to the public sector. and very little of it was actually used to rebuild Manila. It was built for other economic projects like power generating plants, building a irrigation system, a dam in Marikina, trying to refloat wrecks, Japanese shipwrecks in the Philippines, things like that. So it was not directly meant to rebuild the losses. So the Japanese reparations did not really address the issue of the war damage.
There you go. Thank you, sir. Another question from our Facebook viewers. From Maria Selvencio. For Miss Benipayo, ma'am, how true po na some of the Japanese soldiers are or were Koreans by citizenship?
This is the biggest fake news ever that has been propagated through the years, though. There was really no Korean contingent during the Battle of Manila. There were Taiwanese. In fact, I talked to the older Filipinos who survived the battle, and they would tell me na alam ng Amerikano pag Taiwanese yung soldiers because they surrendered, no? Like the Japanese would fight to their deaths. There were no Koreans at the time, and if there were, they were not in the fighting regiment, mostly workers and MacArthur. Dr. Jose would know more about this because this is where I got my info from him. Back to you, Dr. Jose.
Yeah, it's a kind of what is this? Is one of those urban myths that we've come to grow up with. I heard about this when talking to people in the 60s and the 70s up to the 80s. And then when I first went to Japan, I told my Japanese friends, don't worry about anything because it's the Koreans who did it. And all of my Japanese friends said, where did you learn that? That's not true. And since I studied in Japan, I did track down the units that were here, and the units came from Japan. There were 2 divisions that came from Korea, but they were largely Japanese in Korea, based in Korea. The few Koreans in that were only mixed with the Japanese. So it was very difficult to identify who were Korean and who were Japanese. And some would say, oh, the Koreans use Japanese names. Yes, but we can always look at their birthplace. And when you look at the records of those who surrendered, because you can access this, you can look at the interrogations. Yes, there are quite a number of Taiwanese who surrendered. You can see they will say very clearly they were born in Taipei or somewhere else. But the bulk of those who were captured, really, in the whole Philippines, were from Japan. The number 1 Korean who was charged with war crimes was the head of the prisons, the prisoners of war here. He was the highest Korean officer to ever reach general position. But all the other Koreans, the Japanese suspected the Koreans and they did not want to give them guns until very, very late. So most of the Koreans who were taken in by the Japanese army were really brought to Manchuria, brought to China. Very few were brought here. So I think that was a deliberate myth that some people were spreading during the war and immediately after.
There you go. I hope, Maria, that was clear. Our speakers have clearly said it's a myth. There you go. So another one from our Zoom participants from Ian Christian Cosido. Is it true that the alleged bones of Andres Bonifacio got destroyed or lost during the Second World War?
Well, it's possible. I'm not sure. They vanished. They're supposed to have been exhibited in the 1930s, but they vanished along the way. They may have been in the National Museum, and the National Museum was destroyed during the war. So it's possible, but I really cannot answer for sure.
Any addition, Ms. Benipayo?
No, I haven't heard or read about.
Okay. Another question from Mervin Taule. The question goes to either Dr. Jose or Ms. Benipayo. Given the atrocities committed in Manila, do the Japanese treat the Filipinos inferior to them like they have treated the Chinese?
I think they were worse sa Chinese than the Filipinos, no? But they have this really air of superiority, this feeling of superiority, considering that they consider themselves to head the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But I think they're mas
mas malupit, or I don't know the correct term that I should be using, but they were harsher on the Chinese than the Filipinos in general. That's just what I think from all my readings about that period.
So actually, they tried to win over the Filipinos in the beginning. They tried to use a soft touch. They tried to use appeal to some using propaganda. But because the guerrilla resistance movement was so strong and they knew that they could not turn the tide, what's interesting is that the Japanese who stayed in the Philippines longer, and some of them had fought in Bataan, in Mount Samat, they had fought there, and many of them had one whole division stayed here until the end. They fought in Leyte. These Japanese who stayed here long enough eventually learned a little Tagalog. They learned the people's mannerisms and they became a little friendlier. So much so that when Tokyo sent an inspector here, they said the Japanese soldiers in the Philippines have become too soft. And in 1944, they brought in all of these reinforcements coming from mainland Japan, from northern China, from Taiwan, and these people did not know anything about the Philippines. So they simply were very, very they were very strict towards the Filipinos. And so unlike the earlier Japanese who landed in 1942, who fought in Bataan actually, some of them had become acclimated. But those who came in later only could see that the guerrillas were a persistent thorn. They could not tell the guerrillas from the non-guerrillas. So they thought children and women were also part of the guerrillas. And so that's why some of the officers really decided to kill en masse.
Thank you, sir. Next question from Anami Di Maliwat. How long po bago naka-recover or na-restore yung mga damages sa building after Battle of Manila?
Okay, it took quite some time. The Manila Cathedral, I think, was rebuilt by the 1950s, mid 1950s. I know there was a big ceremony when they reopened the Manila Cathedral. UP in Padre Fauro was rebuilt but by that time UP had moved to Diliman. So the UP buildings became the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice, and so forth. And those were functioning by the mid-50s. So I think more or less 10 years. By the early to mid-50s, the major government buildings were running again. Quezon Bridge was restored to its full glory by about 1951. All the bridges actually that were destroyed by the Japanese were immediately, they had temporary bridges put in place within 1 month. So over Jones Bridge, you could cross into Escolta area. But for other buildings, they were never rebuilt. The Intramuros area, for example, most of the churches were never rebuilt and they moved outside. And many other schools, Ateneo, for example, Ateneo also moved to Loyola Heights. They left their Padre Faura campus. And then others moved to Makati, others moved to Quezon City. So it took a while for Manila to get back on its feet.
Thank you, sir. Another question here from one of our Facebook viewers, Janice Felipe. Good afternoon. Not related to the Battle of Manila, but my question is, may mga bayan po ba sa bansa, particular sa Luzon, na kung saan mayroon na ring presensya ng sundalong Hapon na hindi masyadong napinsala? Maybe we can ask Ms. Benipayo?
Again, are there other bayan in your question? Sorry, Ms. Lana.
It's okay. Ulitin ko po, good afternoon, not related to the Battle of Manila, but my question is, may mga bayan po ba sa bansa, partikular sa Luzon, na kung saan mayroon rin presensya ng sundalong Hapon na hindi masyadong napinsala?
I think there would probably be some, no? Pero from what accounts I heard from my aunts or the older people that I know, usually, like my mother-in-law, she said she's the Abad Santos, no? Towards the end of the war daw, they went to near Arayat, but not really Arayat. They hid there. And they said they lived in peace. Parang walang gera, pero wala ring Hapon. So maybe it goes hand in hand. No? Pag may Hapon, syempre, may skirmishes, especially if there's a guerrilla there. But I think the more peaceful places would be ones without much Japanese presence.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Another one here from Carolina. Why is it becoming a common narrative in social media that the Philippines would not have been involved and suffered atrocities of war if the US was not present in the country? Now, this is a little bit controversial. Dr. Jose, can you please answer this
Well,
question?
I think we would have been taken by the Japanese anyway. So the reason why the Japanese came in 1941 was because the Americans were here, the bases were here, but the Philippines was a Commonwealth already. We were already on our way to independence. We had been declared a Commonwealth in 1935. We were prepared to defend ourselves. Kaya nga may National Defense Act. And that's why we had the Philippine Army we had our OTC for national defense. So if the Americans were not here, the Japanese would most probably have come in anyway, because what they needed in Southeast Asia was oil from Indonesia. They needed rubber from Malaya. They needed from the Philippines, and they were very well aware of this. Copper, they needed our tin, they needed our manganese. They knew that they had all this. So they had agents in the Philippines long, long before. They knew exactly what the Philippines had. They knew the lumber resources, they knew the mineral resources. And so even if the Americans were not here, kaya in fact, there was already a growing fear that if World War II had not broken out and the Americans left in 1946, the Japanese would come in very quickly. And I think the Japanese were moving to do that. Now, when the war broke out, syempre, the Philippines was part of that war. We were bombed the first day of the war. And so we automatically sided with the Americans. Already by that time, whether or not the Americans were in the war, parang we could see that what the Japanese had done in China was something that we could not tolerate. Remember that there was that war, undeclared war in China since 1937. There was the rape of Nanjing. There were the massacres of the Chinese. And so even before the war, there was already a fear that if the Japanese did take over, the same thing that happened in China would happen here, whether the Americans were here or not. Now, I think one of the questions was about neutrality. And indeed, the Philippine Commonwealth Constitution and even our present constitution say that the Philippines will be a neutral country. Now, we were supposed to negotiate that upon independence. The Americans were supposed to take steps for that. We might have done that, but nag-umpisa na yung gera. We could not declare neutrality. Quezon briefly wanted that initially, but it was impractical. Once the war started, that was it. Now, could we have avoided the war? I don't think we could have, given the strategic position that the Philippines was in. And we still are in that same position today.
Thank you, sir. Any insights po, Ma'am Desiree?
About the last question, you mean?
Yes, ma'am.
I think I agree with Dr. Jose, no, in that even if talagang sasakupin tayo ng bansang Hapon, because they had that vision of being the leader of Asia, di ba? So kay may Amerikano dito or wala, talagang they need us for our strategic position and our mineral elements, which they badly needed for their all the machinery and equipment. Yeah. So napalala lang siguro yung galit nila sa Amerika, nadagdagan lang. But even if the Americans were not here, we would really have been occupied.
Thank you po. Okay, next one. This is actually not a question, but this is from Sheila Garcia. Sana po magkaroon ng historical movies po about po sa mga Philippine heroes ng World War II. Salamat po. So aside from the ones mentioned po, Ms. Benipayo, can you recommend pa po other movies about our World War II heroes?
Yeah, there's some. There's Unsurrendered, about the hunters ROTC guerrillas. Ano pa ba? There's a story there's one about another hunter ROTC, si
Campo.
Dr. Jose, what was the other movie? Yeah. About Manny de Ocampo, Emmanuel de Ocampo. And there's some indie movies also, which the one about the Igorots who fought in World War II, no? So siguro baka ngayon, since digitally mabilis mahanap yung mga yan, pwede. And for the teachers, I reiterate my what I said earlier, that if you want the movie screened in your schools, in your respective schools, we are very, very open to do that. Para lalo natin matuluan yung mga bata mahalin yung ating bayan. Which is sadly very lacking in our kids now. But yun nga yung gusto ko lang idagdag, no? Marami rin sa atin sasabi na yung mga bata ngayon, parang wala na silang pake or they're not interested in stuff. But when I see their faces after we screen Honor, when I see their reactions after screening, nakita ko na we have hope. They like history. Kailangan lang i-present sa kanila in a very interesting way. Siyempre, sino ba naman ikaw, 10 years old, 11 years old, pamememorizein ka ng mga petsa at pangalan at lugar, di ba? Medyo mahirap at boring naman yon. So, we have to present it in a very, modern manner, very visual manner. And with this, they retain it. And they are appreciative of it. And they will love their country more.
Yeah, someone mentioned The Great Raid, which was a big Hollywood movie not too long ago. I think the problem with The Great Raid is na parang supporting role lang yung Pilipino doon. It was to rescue American prisoners of war. Now, there are, aside from movies, there are quite a number of relatively short documentaries. There was one on the Aitas in the Zambales area that aired over TV some time ago. There are some other smaller ones. Sayang, because there are so many stories. There was a documentary, it's not been finished. I don't know. I hope it will finish one of these days, on the Koga papers, which were recovered by guerrillas of Cebu, and which was a major strategic contribution to the war. Mga fishermen lang ito. They got the papers, yung pala secret plans ng Japanese Navy ito. That documentary is in the works, and Des, I don't know if we can mention that one we were working on also, about General Alfredo Santos.
Yes.
And what's so interesting is, for example, you go into Mindanao and you have Muslims and Christian Filipinos and even Lumads working together to fight the Japanese. And this has not been the subject of a documentary or a full-scale movie.
Miss Lana, I just like to add, a few months ago, I delivered a webinar on the women of the Philippine resistance. So, ang dami nating unsung heroes na kababaihan. So, I was able to come up with, I just had to condense it, but at least 20, na storya ng mga kababaihan na, worked for for the underground or worked for the resistance as guerrillas. Help secure food, for the people. Napakarami. If any teacher would want to show that, I can give them my recording on that. Ang ganda kasi niya, talagang hindi lang, kasi when we hear about guerrillas and such, always kalalakihan yung nasa isip, di ba? But little do our students know that there were women involved, no? In fact, a tenth of our guerrillas were female. Bihira lang may alam niyan, di ba? Because a lot of them, did not look for that recognition after the war. They just went back to being, normal citizens. And ang daming kababaihan who offered their lives, matulungan lang yung ating mga guerrilla, matulungan yung ating mga kababayan at that time. So for those teachers also who want, you can message me anytime and I can give you that recording link which you can use also for your classroom sessions.
There you go. Thank you very much po, Ms. Benipayo. So I hope Ms. Sheila Garcia, you were able to take down notes because just like what Ms. Benipayo said, this is very important, especially now na kailangan i-present na natin ng bagong packaging kung yung mga history natin sa kabataan. So I think this is a very perfect way to do it. Thank you very much for that. Another question po. This is from Beltran. Okay, hold on for a second. This is from one of our Zoom participants. This is addressed to Dr. Jose. Is it just really the Japanese forces who were in charge of committing these atrocities, or was it along with the Kempeitai or the Japanese police forces or unit perhaps?
Okay, the Japanese Kempeitai or the Japanese military police were part of the Japanese armed forces. They were a separate section. In fact, they were almost independent of the regular chain of command, which is why they could even arrest Japanese officers and Japanese soldiers. But the Kempeitai were very, very brutal because they were trained to be very brutal in addressing counter Japanese operations. They were counterintelligence specialists. So they were trained to torture people. But in terms of numbers, it's surprising that given the infamous reputation that they have now, that there were very few of them. They were in Fort Santiago, any major city that had a big building or a jail, that's where the Kempeitai was. In Cebu City, for example, is the Cebu Normal University. That's where they were. The jail houses in most towns were Kempeitai positions, but they were very few if you look at the total number of Japanese in the military occupation force. It's just that their reputation was so bad that really you can imagine torture or beheading or beating. That's what they gained because of what they did. But again, they were kind of a minority of the Japanese, and they were also under the direct command of the Japanese.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jose. Okay, unfortunately, we might be running out of time now, so we still have a couple of questions here, but we have to end our discussion here. So if you still have questions, our Zoom participants, Facebook viewers, please do send us an email sa vmhd.customercare@pvao.gov.ph, and we will do our best to answer your questions. Again, we now end our discussion for today. Thank you very much, Dr. Jose and Ms. Benipayo. It has been a very fruitful discussion, and thank you for satisfying our curiosity. So now I am giving back the floor to our hosts for today. Thank you.
Thank you for delivering all the questions here on Zoom and on our Facebook Live broadcast, Ms. Felici. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in our Q&A, for sending in your questions. Thank you also to our speakers, Dr. Jose and Ms. Benipayo, for entertaining our audience's questions. As we now near the end of our program, let us have our Acting Chief of PVAO Veterans Historical and Memorial Division, Colonel Agerico Amagna, for his closing remarks.
George Santayana once said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." This makes learning history or knowing the events that transpired in the past guide us on how we live in the present and how we foresee the future. As we cope with the worldwide health crisis, we adapted to the new normal with social media as the most utilized platform to substitute for the physical or the face-to-face social engagements, especially for work and school. This enabled us to utilize the available technology and use it to enhance our learning. This digital age allowed even those who live in faraway places to have access to those online seminars. With this, we are allowing greater reach in educating as well as encouraging the youth in learning about the heroism of our veterans. Like our Filipino veterans who fought courageously during the difficult battles that our country experienced in the past, we must also endure the difficult life during this pandemic head-on. On behalf of the members of Pangkat PVAO, we extend our gratitude to those who have registered and participated in this initial episode of the Kagitingan PVAO Historical Webinar Series 2021. Again, our small and humble contribution that aims to install historical awareness amongst the Filipino people, especially the youth, the future defenders of this country. Join us again on our next episodes, and together let us unite in rekindling nationalism among this generation and future generations to come. Relive and understand the memories of our history that will pave the way towards a future that is historically aware of its own roots. Maraming salamat at magandang araw sa inyo.
For those who were able to pre-register, We will be sending a link to your email. Kindly accomplish the evaluation, and then we will be sending you your e-certificate after a week. Also, we are inviting everyone to the next episode of our Kagitingan Webinar Series on March 12, 2021. Mr. Mariano Banaag will be giving a presentation entitled Japanese Total Philippine Occupation is a Myth, while Dr. Augusto de Viana will be discussing the Yamashita treasure.
That concludes today's webinar. Once again, we would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and most especially our well-regarded speakers for imparting their knowledge on the topics discussed. And also, thank you to the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Philippine Veterans Bank, Mount Samat FTES, USC Department of History, PUP Department of History, De La Salle University Department of History, and UP Departamento ng Kasaysayan for partnering with us for making this project a success. Don't worry, this is just the beginning of a series of webinar, and we hope to see you soon in the next one. I am Maria Magagrace Sahagin.
And I am Nico Orero. We have been your hosts for today. Thank you and good afternoon.